The barn was going to kill someone. Ethan Cole knew it the moment he stepped inside, the way the crossbeams sagged like broken ribs, how the wind whistled through gaps that shouldn't exist. He'd come to say no, that's what he did, protect people from their own hope. But then he met her, Mara Bennett, standing in the wreckage of her father's dream, with 30 days before the bank took everything. She wasn't begging, she was fighting. And Ethan, the single father who'd built walls around his heart as carefully as he built houses, felt something crack. Stay with me until the end. Hit that like button and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The truck's engine ticked as it cooled, a rhythm Ethan Cole had heard 1,000 times before. He sat behind the wheel longer than necessary, studying the property through a windshield spider-webbed with 3 years of backcountry driving. The barn dominated the clearing like a shipwreck, gray wood silvered by weather, roof dipping in the middle like a sway-backed horse. Around it, wild grass grew waist-high, dotted with Queen Anne's lace and the rusted skeletons of equipment that had outlived their usefulness. Ethan pulled his work gloves from the passenger seat, leather, broken in, the kind that molded to your hands after enough hours holding hammers and pry bars. He'd owned them since before Sophie was born, back when his hands had been steadier and his life had followed a map he thought he understood. The gravel crunched under his boots as he walked toward the structure. It was worse up close. The foundation stones had shifted, creating a lean he could measure without instruments. The siding showed water damage, black streaks that spoke of rot deep in the bone of the building. One of the main support posts had cracked vertically, held together by sheer stubbornness and the mercy of physics. "Mr. Cole?" He turned. The woman approaching from the house wasn't what he'd expected. Late 30s, maybe 40, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and dirt already under her fingernails despite the early hour. She wore jeans that had seen actual work and a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to her elbows. No jewelry except a watch with a scratched face. Her handshake, when she offered it, was firm enough to communicate confidence without trying to prove anything. "Mara Bennett," she said. "Thanks for coming out. I know it's a drive." 2 hours. Ethan nodded toward the barn. "When did it get this bad?" "Honestly, I don't know." Mara's jaw tightened. "My father died 8 months ago. I've been dealing with other things. By the time I got up here to sort through the property, winter had already done its damage." Ethan walked a slow circle around the structure, his trained eye cataloging failures. The roof needed complete replacement, not just shingles, but the decking underneath. The loft floor sagged dangerously. The main doors hung crooked on hinges that had rusted through. He could smell the decay, that particular sweetness of wood returning to soil. "You planning to use this for something?" he asked, though he already suspected the answer wouldn't matter to his recommendation. "Storage, eventually. Workshop space." Mara followed at a respectful distance, not crowding his inspection. "My father was a furniture maker. All his tools are still in there, under tarps. I want to—" She stopped, reconsidered her words. "I need to preserve what he built." Ethan crouched near the foundation, running his hand along a sill that crumbled at his touch. Carpenter ants had been here. Probably termites too, though he'd need to look closer to be sure. The smell of old hay mixed with something sharper. Animal urine, maybe raccoons or possums claiming the space. "How long do I have to decide?" Mara asked. "Decide what?" "Whether to fix it or tear it down." Ethan stood, brushing dust from his hands. "Ma'am, there's no decision to make. This building is past the point where restoration makes sense. The foundation's compromised, the framing is shot, and I'd bet money there's structural damage I can't even see yet. You're looking at $60,000, $70,000 minimum to make this safe. And that's if we don't find surprises once we open the walls." Mara's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind her eyes. Not surprise, more like confirmation of a fear she'd already been carrying. "What if money wasn't the primary concern?" she asked quietly. "Then time would be." Ethan gestured at the roof. "We're in April. You've got maybe 2 more months before the next heavy rain finishes what the winter started. That crossbeam there? It's under tension. Could go any day. If someone's inside when it fails—" He didn't finish the sentence, didn't need to. 30 days, Mara said. "I'm sorry?" "I have 30 days before the bank forecloses on the property." She met his eyes directly, and Ethan saw no shame there, just exhausted determination. My father mortgaged this land to buy equipment for the business. When he got sick, the payment stopped. I've been trying to negotiate with them, but they want the land. Apparently some developer's been sniffing around about building vacation cabins up here. Ethan looked past her at the mountain vista stretching beyond the clearing. Prime location, he had to admit. Privacy, views, close enough to town for weekenders, but remote enough to feel like escape. The deed has a clause, Mara continued. If I can prove the property is being actively improved, that there's economic value beyond just the land, I can force a refinancing negotiation. But I need documentation, permits, inspections, the whole process. In 30 days, Ethan shook his head. Even if we could make the timeline, which I doubt, the inspection would fail. They'd condemn the structure. What if we do it right? Ma'am. Mara. Mara, Ethan amended. Doing it right is exactly why it can't be done in 30 days. You're talking about foundation work, new framing, roof replacement, bringing everything up to current code. That's a 4-month job with a full crew. I work alone. Then teach me. The words hung in the morning air between them. A crow called from somewhere in the trees, and Ethan heard the distant sound of water, creek or runoff, hard to tell. You have construction experience? He asked, though he suspected the answer. I'm a project manager for a tech company in Denver. I know schedules, logistics, problem solving. Mara's chin lifted slightly. I can follow instructions. I'm not afraid of hard work, and I'm not asking you to lie on any inspections or cut corners. I'm asking you to help me try. Ethan had heard variations of this conversation before. People who watched home renovation shows and thought sweat equity could overcome structural realities. People who confused determination with competence. He'd learned to recognize the difference between someone who wanted to save a building and someone who knew how. But there was something in the way Mara stood, feet planted, shoulders square despite obvious exhaustion, that reminded him of someone. It took him a moment to place it, and when he did, the recognition was uncomfortable. She reminded him of himself 3 years ago, standing in a different kind of wreckage. Let me show you something, Mara said. She walked toward the barn's main entrance, and after a moment, Ethan followed. Inside, the damage looked worse. Daylight streamed through holes in the roof, creating shafts of dusty illumination that only emphasized the darkness elsewhere. The loft floor had partially collapsed, sending broken boards onto the main level below. But Mara navigated the space with confidence, stepping over debris until she reached a tarp-covered shape against the far wall. She pulled the canvas back to reveal a workbench, massive, handcrafted, the kind of furniture that took months to build. The joinery was immaculate, each dovetail perfect, the wood aged to a deep honey color that spoke of decades of use. Tools hung on a pegboard above it, organized with the precision of someone who knew exactly where everything belonged. My father built this when he was 23, Mara said softly. Before he had a real shop, before he made his name. He told me once that this bench taught him everything he needed to know about patience and precision. That if you build this foundation right, everything else follows. Ethan ran his hand along the bench's surface, smooth as glass, not a splinter anywhere. The vise still worked, the drawers still slid true, despite the humidity and neglect. Quality like this didn't happen by accident. He left debt, Mara continued, but he also left this. And I know, her voice caught slightly. I know it's just a building. I know it makes more financial sense to walk away, let the bank have it, start over somewhere else. But this barn? It's the last thing he built with his own hands. He was going to retire here, spend his days making furniture just for the joy of it. And I wasn't here when he needed me. I was in Denver, climbing corporate ladders and missing phone calls. She turned to face Ethan directly. So no, this isn't logical. And yes, it's probably impossible. But I'm asking anyway because I can't live with myself if I don't try. I'm asking you to help me build something worth saving. Ethan looked up at the damaged roof, at the light streaming through gaps that would let in rain and snow and time itself. He thought about Sophie, waiting for him at his sister's house in town, about the 3 other jobs he'd turned down this month because they felt wrong, because the clients wanted cosmetic fixes over structural integrity, about the careful, limited life he'd constructed for himself after Emma left, A life built on routine and control and never, ever taking risks that involved other people's hope. I charge $80 an hour, he heard himself say. Materials are separate. I don't work Sundays. That's my daughter's day. And if at any point I determine this project is unsafe or can't meet code, we stop. No arguments. Mara's eyes widened slightly. You're saying yes? I'm saying I'll assess it properly, bring in an engineer if needed. If, and this is a big if, we can develop a plan that's both safe and possible, then we can talk about moving forward. Ethan pulled a small notebook from his pocket, the kind contractors carried for quick measurements. But you need to understand what you're committing to. 30 days means 12, 14-hour days, every day, rain or shine. It means blisters and exhaustion and no guarantee of success. I understand. Do you? Ethan met her gaze. Because most people think they do, right up until day 3 when their whole body hurts and they realize we're not even 10% finished. Mr. Cole, Ethan, Mara almost smiled. Ethan, I buried my father without saying goodbye. I cleaned out his apartment and sold his car and divided his tools among his apprentices. I've spent 8 months drowning in paperwork and debt and guilt. Blisters don't scare me. They stood in the damaged barn with morning light falling around them, and Ethan felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling onto his shoulders. The weight he'd sworn not to carry for anyone except Sophie. The weight that came from caring whether something succeeded or failed. I'll need access to the property deed, he said, his voice shifting into the practical tone he used to maintain distance. Original building plans, if they exist. Contact information for your bank officer. And we'll need to file for permits today if we want any chance of getting inspections scheduled in time. Mara nodded, already pulling out her phone to take notes. One more thing, Ethan added. Why me? You could have called any contractor in the county. Some of them would have taken your money and done half the work I'm describing. I called 6 contractors, Mara said. 3 didn't return my calls. 2 came out, looked around for 5 minutes, and said it was hopeless. The 6th offered to knock it down for free and buy the timber. And the 7th? The 7th was you. Mara's expression was serious. Your website doesn't have testimonials or fancy photos. Just a sentence, built right or not at all. That's what I need. Someone who won't lie to me about what's possible. Ethan felt something shift in his chest, a sensation he'd almost forgotten. The quiet satisfaction of being understood correctly. I'll be back tomorrow morning at 6, he said. Bring work gloves and boots with ankle support. We're going to start by tearing out everything that can't be saved. Everything? Most of it. Ethan gestured around the barn. Sometimes you have to destroy something to discover what's worth keeping. The drive back to town gave Ethan too much time to think. The mountain road unwound in switchbacks, and his truck knew the path well enough that his hands could move automatically while his mind wandered into territory he'd marked off limits. He thought about the workbench, about craftsmanship that outlasted the craftsman, about fathers and daughters and the things left unfinished between them. Sophie was waiting on his sister's porch when he pulled up, still in her school uniform despite it being Saturday. 7 years old and already learning to read his moods through the windshield. Did you take the job? She asked as he climbed out. How do you know there was a job? You have your thinking face. You only get that when you're deciding about work. Sophie fell into step beside him, her small hand finding his automatically. Also, Aunt Marie says you've been turning down jobs for 3 weeks, which means you're being picky again. Ethan glanced at his sister, who stood in the doorway with her arms crossed and an I told you so expression. It's a barn restoration, he told Sophie. Up in the mountains. 30-day deadline. That's impossible, Sophie said matter-of-factly. Probably. Are you going to try anyway? Ethan looked down at his daughter, this small person who'd learned too young to be resilient, who'd watched her mother leave and her father rebuild their life one careful decision at a time, who trusted him to make good choices even when those choices were hard. Yeah, he said. I think I am. Sophie squeezed his hand. Then you'll figure it out. You always do. The confidence in her voice made Ethan's throat tight. He wondered if that was burden or blessing, being someone's certainty in an uncertain world. That night, After Sophie was asleep in her room with its carefully organized bookshelves and nightlight shaped like a crescent moon, Ethan sat at his drafting table in the garage workshop. He'd converted the space 3 years ago when working from home became necessary and babysitters became a line item in a budget that couldn't afford many line items. He pulled out the photos he'd taken of Mara's barn, spreading them across the table's surface. With a mechanical pencil and straight edge, he began sketching, not the barn as it was, but as it could be. Foundation reinforcement here, new support posts there. The roof would need complete replacement, which meant crane rental or hand-hauling materials up a ladder. 30 days. He'd built a 3-bedroom house in 4 months once, but that was with a crew of 6 and no surprises. This project would be nothing but surprises, the kind revealed when you pulled back walls and discovered decades of amateur repairs and deferred maintenance. But as he drew, Ethan felt something he hadn't experienced in months: engagement. The particular focus that came from solving a puzzle that mattered. Not just another cookie-cutter renovation or insurance repair, but something that required him to think, to adapt, to remember why he'd learned this trade in the first place. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "This is Mara. Found the original building plans. Also contacted county office. Permits can be filed Monday. Thank you for saying yes." Ethan stared at the message for a long moment. Through the garage window, he could see the kitchen light still on, Sophie's backpack hanging on its designated hook, the careful order of a life built around preventing chaos. He typed back, 6 a.m. Don't be late. Her response came immediately. I won't. Ethan set the phone down and returned to his sketches. Outside, the April night was cool and clear, full of the kind of silence that made it easy to think. He worked until past midnight, filling pages with calculations and load-bearing estimates and contingency plans. It was only later, lying in bed with exhaustion pulling at his edges, that he allowed himself to acknowledge the truth he'd been avoiding since the moment Mara pulled back that tarp. He wasn't taking this job because the barn deserved to be saved. He was taking it because he recognized the look in Mara Bennett's eyes. The look of someone trying to build something good from the wreckage of something broken. The look of someone fighting alone, with too much at stake and not enough time. The look he saw in his own mirror every morning. Sunday belonged to Sophie, always. They had breakfast at the diner on Main Street, the one with the red vinyl booths and waitress who'd known Sophie since she was 4 and always brought her chocolate milk without being asked. Then the farmer's market, where Sophie picked out vegetables with the seriousness of someone half her age, comparing prices and checking for bruises. We need carrots, she announced, holding up 2 bunches for comparison. This one's cheaper but smaller. This one's bigger but costs more. Which is better value? Weight them, Ethan suggested. Sophie borrowed the vendor's scale, measured carefully, did the math in her head. The expensive one. More carrot per dollar. The vendor, Mrs. Chen, who sold organic produce from her family farm, smiled approvingly. Smart girl. She gets it from her mother, Ethan said automatically, then wished he hadn't. But Sophie just shrugged, unbothered. Mom was good at math. Dad's good at building. I'm good at both. They spent the afternoon at the park, where Sophie had recently discovered the climbing wall and approached it with the same methodical determination she applied to everything else. Ethan spotted her from below, close enough to catch, but far enough to let her find her own path. How high are you going? He called up. All the way. Sophie's sneaker found a foothold, her small fingers gripping the textured holds. That's the point of climbing, Dad. You don't stop halfway. Ethan watched her ascend, steady and focused, and thought about barns and deadlines and the difference between impossible and merely difficult. That evening, after dinner and homework, and the bedtime routine they'd perfected through repetition, Sophie asked the question Ethan had been expecting. Is this job different from the other ones? He sat on the edge of her bed, the same way he had every night since Emma left. What makes you think it's different? You're nervous. You don't get nervous about normal jobs. I'm not nervous. Sophie gave him the look, the one that said she was 7, but not stupid. You reorganized your tools twice today. You only do that when you're worried about something. Ethan sighed. The timeline is tight, and the client is counting on this working. Do you like her? Who? The client. The barn lady. I don't know her well enough to like or not like her. Sophie considered this. But you want to help her anyway. It's my job to help people build things. No, Sophie corrected gently. It's your job to build things. You help people because you want to. Ethan looked at his daughter, this small, wise person who understood him better than he sometimes understood himself, and decided honesty was worth more than deflection. Her father died, he said quietly. She's trying to save something he built. I think I understand why that matters to her. Sophie nodded slowly. Because things people build last longer than people do. Yeah, something like that. Like how you built this house? So it would last for me? Ethan's throat went tight again. Exactly like that. Sophie was quiet for a moment, then, I think you should help her, even if it's hard. Maybe especially if it's hard. Why especially? Because the hard things are the ones worth doing. You told me that when I wanted to quit piano. Ethan had to laugh, caught by his own logic. I did, didn't I? You did. Sophie yawned, already half asleep. So you better get it done, Dad. You don't stop halfway. He kissed her forehead, turned off the light, and stood in the doorway for a long moment watching her breathe in the darkness. This small person who carried half of him and half of someone who'd left, and who somehow made sense of both halves in a way he was still learning. Tomorrow, the work would begin. Tomorrow he'd drive back up that mountain road and start tearing apart a building to save it. Tomorrow, he'd work beside a woman he barely knew, fighting a deadline that was probably impossible and a bank that had already made up its mind. But tonight, he stood in his daughter's doorway and felt something he hadn't felt in 3 years. Hope. Not certainty. Not confidence. Just hope. It would have to be enough. Monday morning arrived cold and clear. Ethan loaded his truck while the sun was still deciding whether to rise. Table saw, miter saw, generator, tool chest, sawhorses, enough lumber for temporary bracing. The truck sat lower on its suspension by the time he finished, and he made a mental note to account for the weight on the mountain roads. Sophie emerged from the house in her pajamas, hair sleep wild. Too early for you to be up, Ethan said. Wanted to see you off. She handed him a travel mug of coffee. When had she learned to make coffee? And a paper bag. Sandwich for lunch. Peanut butter and honey, because you'll forget to eat otherwise. Ethan took both, feeling that familiar ache of pride and sadness mixed together. When did you get so grown up? Somebody had to. But she smiled when she said it, wrapping her arms around his waist in a quick hug. Build something good, Dad. The drive up gave him time to review his mental checklist. Permits filed first thing. Marie had agreed to handle the county office run while he worked. Structural assessment would take most of the day. Demo could start tomorrow if the bones were sound enough. 30 days minus 1. 29 left. Mara's truck was already in the driveway when he arrived, along with something Ethan hadn't expected. A small camping trailer hooked to the hitch. She emerged from the barn as he parked, wearing work clothes that looked new but practical. Morning. You're living on site? Ethan nodded toward the trailer. Seemed more efficient than driving 3 hours round trip every day. Mara handed him a cup of coffee from a thermos. Black, right? I guessed. You guessed right. Ethan accepted it, surprised by the gesture. You didn't have to... I know, but we're going to be spending a lot of hours together. Figured we might as well start with caffeine. They stood in the morning cold, steam rising from their cups, and studied the barn like generals planning a siege. So, Mara said eventually, where do we start? Ethan set down his coffee and pulled on his work gloves, the familiar leather conforming to his hands like memory. We start, he said, by finding out what's still worth saving. He walked toward the barn and Mara fell into step beside him, and the work began. Inside, with morning light slanting through the damaged roof, Ethan moved methodically through the space with a flashlight and measuring tape. He knocked on support posts, listening for hollowness. He prodded siding, checking for soft spots. He climbed a ladder to examine the loft structure, testing each board before trusting it with his weight. Mara followed quietly, taking photos on her phone when he pointed out specific damage. asking questions that showed she was actually listening. "This beam here," Ethan indicated a massive timber running the length of the barn, "is hand-hewn. Pre-1900 probably. See the adze marks?" Mara leaned closer. "Can we save it?" "Have to." Ethan ran his hand along the scarred wood. "They don't make them like this anymore. It's holding most of the roof load. We reinforce it, sister, on new supports, but we don't replace it." "Because it's historic?" "Because it's better than anything I could buy." Ethan moved to the next post. "Your father knew what he was doing when he chose this building. The foundation's damaged, the roof's shot, but the core structure? It's solid. Built by someone who understood wood." "My grandfather," Mara said. "He built this in 1957. Took him 2 years, working weekends and evenings. My dad used to tell me stories about helping him. He was only 10, but he'd carry boards and hand up nails." Ethan absorbed this information silently. 3 generations, this barn. 3 generations of men who'd worked with their hands, who'd understood that quality took time. No pressure, he thought wryly. By noon, he had a complete assessment. The foundation needed 12 new piers. The roof required full replacement: decking, rafters, shingles, flashing. 4 support posts needed replacement or sistering. The loft floor was a loss, had to come out completely. Siding could be salvaged in places, replaced in others. He spread his sketches on the workbench, Mara's father's workbench, and walked her through it. "Realistically," he said, "this is a 3-month project with a crew. We're 2 people with 1 month. So we have to be strategic. We don't restore everything. We stabilize what's critical and make it code compliant." "What does that mean practically?" Ethan pulled out a red pen, began marking priorities. "Foundation first. Can't build on a weak base. That's week 1. Framing and supports week 2. Roof week 3. Final week is finishing work, siding, doors, whatever's needed to pass inspection. And if we run into problems, we will run into problems." Ethan met her eyes. "That's not pessimism, that's construction. Old buildings hide secrets. We plan for delays, build in buffer time, stay flexible." Mara studied the sketches, her finger tracing the red marks. "My project management training says this timeline is insane." "It is. But you think we can do it?" Ethan hesitated. Honesty warred with pragmatism. "I think if we work 12-hour days, don't lose any time to weather or equipment failure, and don't hit major structural surprises, we have a chance, not a guarantee. A chance." "I'll take it." Mara extended her hand. "Partners?" Ethan looked at her hand, thinking about all the ways this could fail. About banks and deadlines and the weight of other people's hope. About his daughter waiting at home, trusting him to make good decisions. Then he thought about that workbench, built with patience and precision. About foundations that lasted. He shook her hand. "Partners." The word felt strange in his mouth. He'd worked alone for 3 years, preferring the simplicity of solo projects, the clarity of being responsible only for his own work. But as Mara's grip matched his, firm, committed, unafraid, Ethan felt something shift. Not quite trust yet. Not quite friendship, but possibility. And for now, in the wreckage of this barn with 29 days on the clock, possibility was enough. The first sledgehammer swing echoed across the mountain like a declaration of war. Ethan brought it down on the rotted section of loft floor, and the wood surrendered with a crack that sent dust spiraling through the morning light. Mara stood below, ready with the wheelbarrow, her leather gloves already dark with sweat despite the cool temperature. "That's the easy part," Ethan called down. "Gravity does half the work on demo." "And the hard part?" "Making sure we don't bring down anything we want to keep." He studied the beam above his head, calculating angles and stress points. "Hand me that pry bar?" They fell into a rhythm quickly, Ethan working high, Mara clearing debris below. He'd expected her to slow him down, to need constant instruction or reassurance. Instead, she watched what he did once, then anticipated what he'd need next. Pry bar became hammer, became saw, without him having to ask twice. By mid-morning, the loft floor was gone, revealing the full skeleton of the barn's structure. Ethan climbed down, his shirt stuck to his back with exertion, and stood beside Mara to survey their progress. "It looks worse," she observed. "It is worse. We just removed everything hiding the real problems." Ethan pointed to a junction where 2 beams met. "See that gap? That's settling. And those cracks in the post? Water damage, probably 20 years old. Your father knew these issues existed. He mentioned wanting to restore it every time I visited. Mara's voice carried an edge of regret. Always next summer or after this commission. Then he ran out of summers. Ethan understood the weight of postponed intentions. He'd had a list himself once, things he'd meant to fix in his marriage, conversations he'd meant to have. Time had a way of making decisions for you if you waited too long. We're not postponing anything now, he said. Foundation peers arrive tomorrow. Today, we finish demo and prep the site. They worked through lunch. Mara's sandwiches eaten standing up, efficiency trumping comfort. Ethan noticed she matched his pace without complaint, hauling debris to the burn pile, organizing salvageable wood by size and condition. When a splinter pierced her palm deep enough to draw blood, she pulled it out with pliers, wrapped the wound with electrical tape, and kept working. You should clean that properly, Ethan said. I will, later. Mara lifted another board onto the salvage pile. We're losing daylight. We lose more if you get an infection. She stopped, met his eyes with something between annoyance and amusement. Do you always argue with people who agree with you? Only when they're being stubborn about safety. Noted. But she went to the trailer and came back with the wound properly cleaned and bandaged. Better? Better. The afternoon brought the kind of physical work that erased thought, just muscle and repetition and the satisfaction of visible progress. They tore out the old foundation skirting, cleared 50 years of accumulated debris from under the barn, leveled the ground where new piers would go. Ethan's shoulders burned with familiar exhaustion, the good kind that came from productive labor. Around 4, Mara's phone buzzed. She glanced at it, frowned, and declined the call. Problem? Ethan asked. Bank officer, 3rd time today. She pocketed the phone. They're getting nervous that I'm actually trying to save this place. What happens if you answer? They pressure me to accept their buyout offer. Tell me I'm being emotional and impractical. Try to make me feel stupid for fighting. Her jaw set in a way Ethan was starting to recognize, determination wrapped around hurt. I spent 8 months being reasonable with them. Now I'm done talking. Ethan understood that too. There was a point where words became obstacles, where action was the only language that mattered. He'd reached that point the night Emma's lawyer called with the custody proposal. 50-50 split, as if Sophie were a business asset to be divided cleanly down the middle. He'd stopped arguing and started documenting every school pickup, every packed lunch, every bedtime story. Built his case the same way he built houses, one measured piece at a time. They'll have to talk to you eventually, he said, when the inspection passes and their foreclosure case falls apart. You sound confident. I'm paid to be confident. Ethan leveled another section of ground, checking his work with a spirit level. Whether I feel it is different. Mara laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of her. That's the most honest thing anyone's said to me in months. By the time they quit for the day, the barn looked like a crime scene. Debris everywhere, interior gutted, the structure stripped to its bones. But those bones stood straighter somehow, unburdened of rot and pretense. Ethan walked the perimeter one last time, checking his measurements against the lengthening shadows. Tomorrow we pour foundation, he said. That means a 4 a.m. start. Concrete truck can't make it up this road after sunrise, too narrow for safe passing. 4 a.m. Mara nodded, unfazed. I'll have coffee ready. Ethan drove home with his windows down despite the cold, letting the mountain air strip away the day's dust and sweat. His mind was already running through tomorrow's sequence. Forms had to be set perfectly, rebar tied correctly, concrete poured and finished before it set up. No room for error on foundation work. Everything built on top depended on getting this right. Sophie was at the kitchen table when he arrived, homework spread around her like evidence of serious study. She looked up, assessed his exhaustion with one glance, and announced, Aunt Marie left lasagna. I already set the table. When did you become the parent? When you became the one coming home tired. She closed her math book. How was day 1? Productive. Ethan washed his hands at the sink, scrubbing concrete dust from under his nails. We cleared the loft, prepped for foundation work. Made good progress. Is she nice, the barn lady? Ethan considered the question while he dried his hands. Nice seemed insufficient to describe Mara, the quiet competence, the way she worked through pain, the determination that burned steady instead of bright. She's committed, and she doesn't quit. Like you, Sophie observed. Maybe. They ate dinner with the easy silence of people who didn't need to fill every moment with conversation. Afterward, Sophie did the dishes without being asked. When had that become routine? While Ethan reviewed his notes for tomorrow. 4 a.m. meant 3 hours of sleep if he was lucky. Worth it, though. Foundation couldn't wait. He was getting ready for bed when his phone buzzed. Mara again. Found my father's original building journal. Has notes about every repair he made, every modification. Thought you might want to see it before we start foundation work. Ethan stared at the message. A building journal was gold for restoration work. A map of everything the structure had endured, every weakness already discovered and addressed. Or not addressed, which was equally important information. He typed back, "Bring it tomorrow. Might save us from expensive surprises." Her response came immediately. "See you at 4. Sleep well." Fat chance of that, Ethan thought. But he lay in bed with his alarm set for 3:30, and when sleep came, it was deep and dreamless. The sleep of someone whose body had been used the way it was meant to be used. The alarm felt brutal when it sounded. Ethan dressed in the dark, left a note for Sophie, and drove up the mountain with his headlights cutting tunnels through the pre-dawn fog. The construction site looked different at this hour, otherworldly, the barn skeleton emerging from mist like something remembered rather than real. Mara's trailer showed light. When he knocked, she opened the door already dressed, coffee brewing behind her. "Punctual," she said. "Foundation waits for no one." Ethan accepted the mug she offered. "You have that journal?" She handed him a leather-bound notebook, pages yellowed and filled with precise handwriting. Ethan flipped through it by flashlight. Dates, measurements, observations written with the care of someone who understood that details mattered. A crack in the north post, noted and monitored across 3 years. A leak in the southwest corner, traced to a damaged flashing and repaired. The settling of the foundation, measured annually, pronounced stable in the final entry. "Your father was meticulous," Ethan said. "Furniture maker's habit. Measure everything twice, trust nothing to memory." Mara poured her own coffee. "Does it help?" "Immensely. This tells me where the weak points are, what's been reinforced, what's original versus repair work. It's like having a conversation with the person who knew this building best." He closed the journal carefully. "We should move these measurements to our own documentation. Make sure we're not duplicating work or missing something he already identified." They spent the next hour transferring information by lantern light, Ethan sketching while Mara read entries aloud. It felt strangely intimate, this sharing of her father's careful observations, the picture that emerged of a man who loved this structure enough to document its every flaw and virtue. The concrete truck arrived at 5, headlights announcing its labored approach up the narrow road. Ethan and Mara had the forms ready, rebar tied, everything measured and checked 3 times. The driver, a man named Carlos, who Ethan had worked with before, backed his truck into position with practiced precision. "Foundation work at dawn," Carlos observed. "Either you're very dedicated or very crazy." "Both," Ethan said. "We've got a deadline." They poured 6 piers before sunrise, working with focused intensity. Ethan directed the concrete flow while Mara vibrated out air bubbles, both of them covered in gray spray within minutes. The work demanded total attention. Concrete didn't forgive mistakes, didn't offer second chances. You got it right the first time or lived with failure forever. By the time the truck pulled away, morning had broken clear and cold across the mountain. 6 perfect piers stood curing, and Ethan felt the first real surge of confidence. Foundation was destiny in construction. Get this right, and everything else became possible. "We're ahead of schedule, Mara said, surveying their work. "By half a day. Don't get comfortable. We'll lose it somewhere else." Ethan stretched his back, feeling muscles protest. "Tomorrow, we pour the rest, then we wait 48 hours for cure time." "What do we do while we wait?" "Framing prep. Cut and measure every beam we'll need for the support structure. When the foundation's ready, we want to move fast." They spent the rest of that day and the next in a blur of measurement and cutting, the rhythmic scream of the table saw punctuating conversations that came easier with each passing hour. Ethan learned that Mara had studied architecture before switching to business, that she could read blueprints as fluently as he could. Mara learned that Ethan had built his first piece of furniture at 12, that his own father had been a contractor until a fall from scaffolding ended his career. "Is that why you're so careful about safety?" she asked, watching him secure a ladder for the fourth time. "Partly. Mostly it's Sophie. She needs at least one parent who comes home intact." Mara was quiet for a moment. "Her mother isn't in the picture?" "She's in Phoenix with her new husband, sends cards on birthdays, calls every few months. Sophie's okay with it. She's resilient like that. But it makes me cautious. Everything I do, I think, what if something happens to me? Who takes care of her?" "That's a heavy weight to carry alone." "You get used to it." Ethan marked another beam for cutting. "What about you? Family besides your father?" "A brother in California. We're not close. My mother died when I was 16, cancer. After that, it was just me and Dad, and then just me." She ran her hand along the wood, feeling for imperfections. "I think that's why losing him hit so hard. He was the last person who remembered me as a kid, who knew my whole story. Without him, I'm starting from scratch with everyone I meet." Ethan understood that loneliness, the kind that came from being unknown in your entirety, from carrying history that no one else witnessed. He'd felt it after Emma left, after her version of their marriage evaporated and he was left defending a truth only he remembered. "Your father's journal," he said. "It's not just about the barn. Every entry shows how he thought, what he valued. That's not gone. That's right here in how he documented every detail, how he refused to settle for quick fixes." Mara's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Thank you for seeing that. Just reading what's written." But Ethan's voice was gentler than usual, and they worked in comfortable silence after that, the saw's scream saying everything words couldn't. On the third day, they returned to foundation work, pouring the remaining 6 piers with the same meticulous attention. By noon, the concrete was placed, and they had 48 hours to kill while it cured. Ethan suggested they use the time to work on the roof framing, cutting and assembling sections they could hoist once the supports were ready. "We're building it on the ground first?" Mara asked, studying his sketch. "Easier to ensure square and true down here, plus safer. Less time working at height means less chance of accidents." Ethan measured twice, marked once, a habit so ingrained it was almost ritual. "Your father's journal mentioned the roof pitch. We'll match it exactly, maintain the original profile." They worked through the afternoon, and Ethan found himself explaining more than instructing, sharing the why behind each decision, the logic that governed good construction. Mara absorbed it all, asking questions that showed she was thinking 3 steps ahead. "Why sister this beam instead of replacing it?" she asked at one point. "Because the original is old-growth timber, denser, stronger than anything harvested now. We're not improving it, we're supporting it." He demonstrated the technique, bolting new lumber alongside old. "Modern materials serve historic structure. Best of both worlds. Like what you're doing with the foundation. New piers supporting original posts." "Exactly. We're not building a replica. We're preserving what deserves to survive while fixing what's failed." Mara was quiet for a moment. Then, "That's a good philosophy for more than just buildings." Ethan glanced at her, saw she was serious. "I suppose it is." They quit at sunset, later than planned, neither willing to stop while progress was being made. Ethan's hands ached in the specific way that meant he'd gripped tools for too many hours straight, but it was the satisfied ache of work well done. "Day 5, Mara said, consulting her phone. 25 days left. We're on schedule?" "We're surviving. Different thing than being on schedule." Ethan loaded tools into his truck bed. "But yeah, so far we're where we need to be." "What's the worst-case scenario from here?" Ethan appreciated that she asked practical questions instead of seeking reassurance. "Weather. If we get a week of rain, we lose too much time. Equipment failure. If the generator dies or I break a critical tool, we're stuck waiting for replacements. Or injury. Either of us gets hurt badly enough to need more than a day's rest, the timeline collapses. So we stay careful, watch the weather, and maintain equipment. And hope we're lucky." Ethan slammed the truck bed closed. "I'll be here at 6 tomorrow. We can start framing assembly while the foundation finishes curing. He drove home with his mind already organizing the next day's work. But when he walked through his door, Sophie was waiting with an expression he'd learned to recognize. The one that meant she had something important to say and was gathering courage to say it. "What's wrong?" he asked immediately. "Nothing's wrong. I just want to talk about something." They sat at the kitchen table and Sophie folded her hands with the seriousness of someone addressing a board meeting. "I think you should invite Mara to dinner," she announced. Ethan blinked. "What?" "The barn lady. You should invite her to eat with us. She's living in a trailer with probably just a camp stove, and you said she works as hard as you do. She must be tired of her own cooking." "Sophie, that's not really appropriate. She's a client." "She's a person who's helping you build something. That's different than a client." Sophie's logic was frustratingly sound. "And you like working with her. I can tell because you're not as grumpy when you come home." "I'm not grumpy." "You're always a little grumpy when you work alone, but this week you've been, I don't know, less alone looking." Ethan stared at his 7-year-old daughter, wondering when she'd developed the ability to read him so accurately. "Even if I wanted to invite her, which I'm not saying I do, it would be weird. We barely know each other." "Then you'd get to know each other." "That's how friendship works, Dad. We're not friends. We're business partners." Sophie gave him that look again, the one that said she saw through every defense he constructed. "You don't talk about business partners the way you talk about her. You said she doesn't quit and she's committed. Those are compliments." "They're observations." "They're compliments," Sophie insisted. "And you never compliment anyone unless you respect them. So invite her to dinner. It's just being nice." Ethan realized he was outmatched. His daughter had inherited her mother's debate skills and his own stubborn logic. Dangerous combination. "I'll think about it," he conceded. "That means yes in dad language." Sophie grinned, triumphant. "I'll make my special pasta. It's impressive, but not too fancy." "I said I'd think about it." But Sophie was already planning the menu, and Ethan knew the battle was lost. He went to bed that night wondering how his carefully controlled life kept expanding beyond the boundaries he'd set. First the barn project, now dinner invitations. Next thing he knew, people would expect him to have actual conversations about things besides lumber grades and load calculations. The thought was more terrifying than any structural failure. Day 6 dawned with clouds threatening rain. Ethan checked the weather forecast 3 times before leaving, decided they had until afternoon before the storm hit. He arrived to find Mara already assembling roof sections according to his diagrams, her measurements exact, her cuts clean. "You didn't have to start without me," he said. "Couldn't sleep. Figured I'd be useful instead of anxious." She held up a perfectly mitered joint. "How's this?" "Professional quality. You sure you haven't done this before?" "I told you. I watch and I learn." She set the piece aside, reached for the next board. "My father used to say craftsmanship is just paying attention combined with giving a damn." They worked through the morning assembling roof sections, and Ethan found himself falling into the kind of easy partnership he'd forgotten was possible. Mara anticipated his needs, maintained her own quality standards, asked for help when she needed it without embarrassment. By noon, they had 4 complete sections ready to hoist, and the foundation piers had cured enough to begin support installation. The rain came at 2, hard and sudden. They scrambled to cover materials and equipment, working in downpour that soaked through clothes in seconds. By the time everything was secured, they were both drenched and laughing at the absurdity of it. "Welcome to mountain construction," Ethan said, wringing water from his shirt. "Weather does what it wants." "How much time did we lose?" "Half a day, maybe. We can make it up tomorrow if this clears." He looked at the sky, reading clouds the way some people read books. "Should be done by evening. We'll get an early start, push through." They retreated to her trailer to wait out the worst of it, and Ethan found himself accepting the coffee she offered, sitting at her tiny table while rain drummed overhead. The space was spare but organized, laptop open to spreadsheets, her father's journal carefully protected in a plastic sleeve, a single photo tacked to the wall showing a man with Mara's eyes and a slight smile. "Your father?" Ethan asked, nodding at the picture. "Last year, his workshop in Denver." Mara's voice carried the particular softness of recent grief. "He was already sick then, but still working every day. Said if he stopped building things, he'd have to think about dying, and he wasn't ready for that yet." "Sounds like someone I would have liked." "He would have liked you too." He respected people who took their work seriously, who didn't cut corners. She refilled both their mugs. I keep wondering what he'd think of all this. If he'd be proud I'm fighting for the barn, or disappointed I let it get this bad in the first place. Ethan thought about his own father, about the weight of inherited expectations, and the impossibility of ever knowing if you'd measured up. He documented every flaw in that journal, he said carefully, every crack, every weak point, but he also documented every repair, every fix. He wasn't recording failure, he was recording attention. The fact that someone cared enough to notice and measure and plan to make it better. He met her eyes across the small table. You're doing exactly what he would have done. You're paying attention and giving a damn. Mara's eyes went bright again, and she looked away, composing herself. When she spoke, her voice was steady. Thank you. I needed to hear that. They sat in comfortable silence while the rain eased from deluge to drizzle. Ethan found himself noticing small details. The precise way she organized her workspace, the calluses forming on her hands, the stubborn set of her jaw that reminded him of Sophie's determination. My daughter thinks I should invite you to dinner, he said, surprising himself. Mara looked up. Your daughter? She's 7, scary perceptive, and apparently decided you're working too hard to be eating well. Ethan felt awkward, which was ridiculous. It was just dinner. It's just pasta, nothing fancy, but if you wanted a break from camp food, I'd love to. Mara smiled, genuinely pleased. When? Tomorrow night? Assuming we survive tomorrow's work. We'll survive. We're too stubborn not to. The rain stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving the world dripping and fresh. They returned to work, and Ethan found his mind wandering to domestic details. What Sophie would cook, whether his house was presentable, if this constituted a boundary being crossed, or just basic human courtesy. He decided it didn't matter. Sophie was right. They were people working toward a common goal, and sometimes people shared meals. Nothing complicated about it. The week progressed in a rhythm of early mornings and late evenings, of progress measured in inches and small victories. They installed support posts, each one plumbed perfectly vertical and secured with hardware that would outlast them all. They hoisted roof sections with a come-along and prayer, Ethan directing while Mara steadied and guided. By day 12, they had framing complete, the barn's skeleton restored and reinforced, standing square and true against the mountain sky. It looks like a barn again, Mara said, standing back to admire their work. It's getting there. Ethan checked his list. Roof next. That's the big one. 2 weeks to frame, sheath, and shingle before inspection. Can we do it? Ask me when it's done. But privately, Ethan was starting to believe they might actually pull this off. The work was good, better than good. Every joint tight, every measurement verified, nothing left to chance. He'd built dozens of structures in his career, but this one felt different. This one mattered in a way he couldn't quite articulate. Saturday arrived with clear skies and Sophie's excited preparation for their dinner guest. She'd cleaned the house with military precision, prepared pasta sauce from scratch, and changed her outfit 3 times before settling on what she deemed casual but nice. It's just dinner, Ethan reminded her, not a state dinner. First impressions matter, Dad. You taught me that. I taught you that about job interviews, not pasta dinners. Same principle applies. Sophie arranged napkins with geometric precision. Be on your best behavior, okay? No talking about boring construction stuff all night. That's literally all we have in common. Then find something else. Ask her about books or movies or what she wanted to be when she grew up. Normal conversation topics. Ethan wondered, not for the first time, who was actually the parent in this relationship. Mara arrived at 6:30 with a bottle of wine and visible nervousness that somehow made Ethan relax. She was as uncertain about this as he was. 2 people stepping outside their established roles into something undefined. You must be Sophie, Mara said, extending her hand. Sophie shook it solemnly. I made pasta. Dad says you work really hard and probably need proper food. Sophie, Ethan warned. It's true, though. Sophie led them to the table, already playing hostess. Sit anywhere. Dinner's almost ready. The evening unfolded with surprising ease. Sophie's pasta was genuinely good, and conversation flowed naturally once the initial awkwardness passed. Mara asked Sophie about school, about her favorite subjects and friends. Sophie, in turn, interviewed Mara with the directness of someone who hadn't learned to be polite about curiosity. "Do you miss your dad?" Sophie asked at one point. "Sophie, that's personal," Ethan started. "It's okay." Mara set down her fork. "Yes, I miss him every day, especially when I'm working on the barn. I keep thinking he'd know exactly how to solve whatever problem we're facing." "Dad says you're really good at building stuff anyway." "He does?" Mara glanced at Ethan. "I said you learn fast and work hard," Ethan clarified, feeling heat rise in his face. "Which is true." "High praise from Dad," Sophie Stage whispered to Mara. "He doesn't compliment people usually." "Okay, that's enough from the peanut gallery," Ethan said, but he was smiling despite himself. After dinner, Sophie showed Mara her room with its organized bookshelves and handmade furniture, pointing out the pieces Ethan had built. "Your dad made all of this?" Mara ran her hand along a desk's surface, admiring the joinery. "He says working with wood helps him think. When he's worried about something, he builds furniture." Sophie opened a drawer to demonstrate the smooth glide. "These are dovetail joints. They're really hard, but they last forever." "Like the ones in your grandfather's workbench," Mara said, and Sophie beamed at the connection. Later, standing on the porch while Sophie got ready for bed, Mara turned to Ethan with something like wonder in her expression. "She's remarkable," she said. "You're raising an incredible human." "She raises herself mostly. I just try not to mess it up too badly." "You're doing more than that." Mara leaned against the railing, looking out at the darkness beyond the porch light. "The furniture in her room, the way this whole house is organized, it's all built with care. Built to last. That's not accident, that's intention." Ethan felt exposed by her observation, seen in a way he usually avoided. "I wanted her to have stability. After her mother left, I wanted everything around her to be solid." "You gave her more than that. You gave her a model for how to move through the world, how to build things that matter, how to show up every day, how to care about quality over convenience." She met his eyes. "That's a rare gift." They stood in the cool evening air, and Ethan felt something shifting between them, partnership deepening into something that might become friendship, might become more. The possibility scared him, but not enough to step back. "We should probably get back to work tomorrow," he said eventually. "Roof won't build itself." 6 a.m.? 5:30. We're behind schedule after the rain delays. Mara laughed. "Of course we are. See you at 5:30. She drove away, and Ethan stood on his porch watching her taillights disappear, feeling the weight of the evening settle around him like a question he wasn't ready to answer. Inside, Sophie was waiting in her pajamas, wearing an expression of barely contained smugness. "Don't say it," Ethan warned. "I'm not saying anything, just that you smiled more tonight than you have in months." "We were being hospitable to a guest." "We were making a new friend," Sophie corrected. "Which is a good thing, Dad. You're allowed to have friends." Ethan kissed her forehead, turned off her light, and retreated to his workshop where the tools and wood didn't ask complicated questions or observe things he wasn't ready to examine. But as he stood at his bench, running through tomorrow's plans, he caught himself thinking about Mara's hands on his daughter's furniture, her appreciation for the care built into every joint. The way she'd seen what he'd been trying to do, build something lasting in a world that felt temporary. Maybe Sophie was right. Maybe friendship was possible. Maybe even necessary. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, it felt like relief. The roof work consumed the next week in a blur of shingles and sweat. Ethan and Mara worked from dawn past dusk, their hands moving in practiced coordination, him nailing while she aligned, switching roles without discussion when fatigue demanded it. The weather held clear and cold, mountain air sharp enough to burn lungs during the climb up and down ladders that grew taller as the work progressed. On day 17, they were laying the final section of decking when Ethan's phone rang. He ignored it the first time, focused on ensuring the plywood sat flush against the rafters. It rang again immediately, the insistence making him pause. "You should answer that," Mara said, reading something in his expression. It was his sister. "Ethan, Sophie's school called. She's in the nurse's office with a fever. They need someone to pick her up." His stomach dropped. "How high?" 102, probably just a bug, but you know their policy." Ethan looked at the roof, at the work still undone, at Mara watching him with concern already forming on her face. The inspection was scheduled for day 28. They had 11 days and at least 10 days of work remaining. Every hour mattered. "I'm on my way," he said. "Go," Mara told him before he could speak. "I'll secure everything up here, make sure nothing blows off overnight. We need to finish the south slope, and we will, tomorrow. Your daughter needs you now." She was already gathering tools, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Family comes first, Ethan. The barn will still be here." He wanted to protest, to explain that falling behind now meant failing entirely, but Sophie's fever pushed aside every other priority. He climbed down the ladder with his chest tight, hating the choice but knowing there was no choice at all. Sophie looked small in the nurse's office, pale and glassy-eyed in a way that made Ethan's protective instincts roar to life. He signed her out, carried her to the truck, despite her weak protests that she could walk, and drove home with one hand on her forehead, checking for changes in temperature. "I'm sorry, Dad," she mumbled. "I know you needed to work today." "Hey, none of that. You don't apologize for being sick." He adjusted the air conditioning, trying to keep her comfortable. "We'll get you home, some medicine in you, and you'll feel better soon." But she didn't feel better soon. The fever spiked to 103 that night, and Ethan found himself doing what he'd done since she was an infant, sitting beside her bed in the dark, cool washcloth on her forehead, monitoring every breath. His mind wanted to drift to the barn, to calculate the hours being lost, but his heart kept him anchored here where he belonged. Mara texted around 8. "How is she?" "Fever. Keeping watch tonight. I finished securing the roof. Everything's weatherproof if it rains. Don't worry about the timeline. Just take care of your girl." Ethan stared at the message, feeling something crack in the careful walls he'd maintained. She understood. Not just intellectually, but in the bone-deep way that came from having carried similar weight. Sophie's fever broke around 3 a.m. He felt it happen, the heat fading from her skin, her breathing deepening into real sleep instead of fevered restlessness. Ethan finally allowed himself to close his eyes, slumping in the chair beside her bed, too exhausted to make it to his own room. He woke to Sophie's hand on his shoulder and daylight streaming through her window. "Dad, you look terrible," she said, her voice hoarse but clearer than last night. "Good morning to you too." He checked her forehead. "Cool. Thank everything." "How do you feel?" "Weak. Hungry. Did you sleep in that chair all night?" "Most of it." Ethan stood, his back screaming protest. "Think you can handle some toast?" She nodded, and he helped her to the kitchen, settling her on the couch with blankets while he made breakfast. His phone showed 7 missed calls from a number he didn't recognize and 1 text from Mara. "County inspector showed up unannounced this morning. Call me when you can." Ethan's blood went cold. Unannounced inspections were never good news. They meant someone was looking for reasons to shut down a project, not help it succeed. He called Mara while the toast was browning, his jaw already tight with anticipation of bad news. "What happened?" "Guy named Gerald Hutchins. Said he was doing routine compliance checks on new permit applications." Mara's voice carried an edge he hadn't heard before, anger wrapped around forced calm. "He spent 2 hours going over everything with a fine-tooth comb, found violations that don't exist, cited codes that don't apply to historic structures, and strongly suggested I'd be better off accepting the bank's offer." "Did he put anything in writing?" "Not yet. Said he'd file his report early next week." She paused. "Ethan, he knew about the foreclosure. Knew specific details I haven't made public. Someone talked to him." Ethan felt the familiar burn of bureaucratic corruption, the kind that made honest work impossible. He'd seen it before. Inspectors on the take, officials pushing private agendas through public channels. It made him furious in a cold, focused way. Did he cite specific violations? Foundation piers too close to the property line, which is garbage because we're 30 feet from the nearest boundary. Inadequate ventilation in the loft space, even though we haven't finished the loft yet. Improper storage of materials, which just means we have lumber stacked outside like every construction site ever. He's building a case to deny final inspection. Ethan's mind was already running through options, none of them good. We need documentation, photos timestamped to prove compliance, copies of the exact codes he's citing, evidence that we're following approved plans. I took photos of everything after he left, and I requested written clarification of every violation he mentioned. Mara's voice hardened. I'm not rolling over for this, Ethan. I've dealt with bullies in boardrooms. This is the same game with a different uniform. Ethan felt something fierce and protective rise in his chest. She was right to fight, but fighting took time they didn't have. We need a strategy, not just for the build, but for the political game around it. Can you come up? I know Sophie's sick, but I'll figure it out. Give me 2 hours. He called his sister, explained the situation, and got Sophie settled at Marie's house with strict instructions to rest and take her medicine. Then he drove up the mountain with his jaw clenched and his mind sorting through every regulation he knew, every loophole that might save them. Mara met him at the barn with a laptop and 3 ring binders full of documentation. They spread it across the workbench, her father's workbench, and began building their defense like generals planning a campaign. The property line issue is easy to disprove, Ethan said, pulling up the survey maps. We have GPS coordinates for every pier. They're all well within setback requirements. The ventilation complaint is premature since the space isn't finished. I can cite the section of code that says final ventilation is verified at final inspection, not during construction. Mara typed rapidly, adding notes to her spreadsheet. They worked through each violation systematically, and Ethan felt the satisfaction of watching a weak case crumble under scrutiny. Hutchins had overplayed his hand, cited too many questionable violations, revealed his agenda too clearly. He'll come back, Ethan said. When this doesn't stick, he'll find something else. Then we make sure there's nothing to find. We don't just meet code, we exceed it. Every joint documented, every material certified, every measurement verified 3 times. Mara's eyes were fierce. We make this barn so perfectly compliant that he has nothing to grab onto. Ethan studied her across the workbench. This woman who'd gone from grieving daughter to fierce warrior in the span of 3 weeks, who'd learned to frame walls and read plans and fight bureaucrats without losing the essential core of who she was. You know, this might not be enough, he said quietly. If someone powerful wants this land, they'll find a way to take it. Then they'll have to fight me for every inch. Mara met his eyes. I'm done being reasonable. Done accepting that some things are inevitable. My father taught me that quality takes time and effort and refusal to compromise, so that's what I'm giving this. Something shifted in that moment, some final wall between them dissolving under the weight of shared purpose. Ethan felt it, the transition from partners to something deeper, from professional respect to personal investment. All right, he said, then we build this perfect. No shortcuts, no assumptions, everything by the book, and then some. They returned to work with renewed intensity, and the next 5 days blurred into a single continuous effort. Roof completed and sealed, every shingle laid with precision. Interior framing reinforced beyond minimum requirements. Electrical rough-in done to commercial standards even though the barn was residential. They worked 12, 14, 16-hour days, fueled by coffee and stubborn determination. Sophie recovered and returned to school, and Ethan found himself explaining less and less about where he was or when he'd be home. She understood, in the way she understood everything, that this had become about more than just a building. On day 23, the call came that Ethan had been dreading. Mara's phone rang during lunch break, and he watched her face go from curious to pale as she listened. When? She asked. How long do I have? She ended the call and sat heavily on a stack of lumber. The bank. They're accelerating the foreclosure. Hutchins filed a preliminary report claiming the property improvements are substandard and unsafe. They're using it as justification to move up the timeline. How much time? 5 days. They're scheduling the seizure for day 28. Her voice was hollow with shock. The same day as our final inspection. Ethan felt rage bubble up, hot and immediate. They're coordinating. Hutchins is feeding information to whoever wants this land, probably getting paid for every roadblock he creates. What can we do? We can fight them in court, but that takes time we don't have. We can file complaints about Hutchins, but those go through the same county office that employs him. Ethan stood, pacing, his mind racing through scenarios. Or we can finish this barn so perfectly that even he can't fail it, force their hand with work so good it can't be denied. 5 days, Ethan. We have exterior siding, all the interior work, final electrical, plumbing connections. So we don't sleep. We work in shifts. I'll take nights, you take days. We overlap during peak hours. He was already calculating, already seeing the path. It's possible. Barely, but possible. Mara stood, squaring her shoulders in the way he'd come to recognize as her preparing for battle. Tell me what needs to happen. They made a list. Not a hopeful list or an optimistic list, but a ruthless triage of absolute necessities. Some things could wait. Cosmetic trim, interior paint, the loft floor reconstruction. Other things were non-negotiable for code compliance and had to be completed perfectly. Ethan called in a favor from an electrician he'd worked with before, got him to commit to a day's work at premium rates. Mara contacted a plumber willing to rough in the connections they needed. Between the specialists and their own labor, they had a chance. A slim chance, but still a chance. That night, Ethan worked until 2 a.m. under portable lights, installing siding in the cold dark. His hands moved automatically, muscle memory taking over when his brain grew too tired to think. Around midnight, Mara emerged from her trailer with fresh coffee and silent company, working beside him even though she'd been up since 4 a.m. "You should be sleeping," he said. "So should you." "I'm used to running on fumes. Single-parent training. I'm used to corporate death marches, tech startup training." She aligned the next board while he nailed. "We're both stubborn idiots, apparently." Ethan laughed, surprising himself. "Apparently." They worked in comfortable silence, the rhythm of the work soothing despite the exhaustion. Around 1, Mara spoke again, her voice quiet. "Thank you for not giving up on this." "I don't give up on things I start." "It's more than that." She held the next board steady. "You could have walked away a dozen times, said it was impossible, too risky, not worth the fight. You didn't." Ethan considered his response carefully. "I spent 3 years building walls around my life. Safe walls, predictable walls, and I convinced myself that was enough, that safety and routine were the same as living." He drove another nail home. "But working on this barn, working with you, I remembered what it feels like to build something that matters, something worth fighting for." Mara was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was rough with emotion. "I'm glad you're here. I couldn't do this alone." "You could," Ethan said honestly. "You're stronger than you think." "Maybe, but I'm glad I don't have to find out." They finished the south wall as the stars wheeled overhead, and Ethan felt something settle in his chest, a sense of rightness that had nothing to do with square corners or level walls. This was what he'd been missing. Not just the work, but the partnership. The shared struggle toward something bigger than either of them alone. Day 24 brought the electrician, a gruff man named Martinez who took one look at the timeline and whistled low. "You're serious about this deadline?" "Dead serious," Ethan confirmed. "All right then. Let's see what we're working with." Martinez moved through the barn with professional efficiency, running wire and installing boxes with the quick competence of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. By evening, he had the rough-in complete and tested, every connection solid and code compliant. "Best I can do in one day," he said, packing his tools. "But it's good work. Should pass inspection without issue." "That's all we need," Ethan said, shaking his hand. "I owe you. Just invite me to the party when you beat these bastards." The plumber came on day 25, roughed in the connections for a future bathroom and utility sink. Not essential for the inspection, but necessary for the building to qualify as improved property. Every element mattered now, every detail a potential weapon in the fight to keep this land. Day 26 found them racing against the clock to finish exterior work. Siding, trim, gutters, downspouts, all the elements that protected the structure and proved it was weather-tight. Mara worked with bleeding hands, her gloves worn through in places, but she never slowed, never complained. Around noon, a car pulled up the driveway. Not a truck or work vehicle, but a sedan. Expensive, out of place on the rural mountain road. Ethan watched it approach with growing tension, his protective instincts firing. A man emerged, mid-50s, wearing a suit that cost more than Ethan made in a month. He surveyed the property with an expression that mixed assessment with entitlement. "Can I help you?" Ethan called down from the roof. James Blackwood. I'm representing a development group interested in this property. The man's smile was professional and cold. I was hoping to speak with Ms. Bennett. Mara climbed down the ladder, and Ethan followed close behind. He didn't like the way Blackwood looked at her, like she was an obstacle to be removed rather than a person to be respected. I'm not interested in selling, Mara said immediately. I understand you're facing some challenges with the county inspection process. These old buildings can be difficult to bring up to code. Blackwood pulled out a business card. My clients are prepared to offer significantly above market value. You could walk away from this stress, take the money, start fresh somewhere else. I said I'm not interested. Ms. Bennett, be reasonable. You're fighting a losing battle against the bank, against time, against an inspection system that's flagged serious safety concerns. His tone sharpened. My clients are patient, but their patience has limits. This offer won't stay on the table indefinitely. Ethan stepped forward, positioning himself slightly between Mara and Blackwood. The lady gave you her answer. Blackwood's eyes flicked to him dismissively. And you are? The contractor ensuring this building passes every inspection with perfect marks. Ethan's voice was level but hard. So unless you have business here, you're trespassing on private property during active construction, safety liability and all that. Something dangerous flickered in Blackwood's expression, anger at being challenged by someone he considered beneath him. You should advise your client about the realities of her situation. I advise my clients about structural integrity and building codes. The rest is her decision. Blackwood turned back to Mara. You have my card. When this falls apart, and it will, call me. We might still be interested, though the offer will be lower after foreclosure. He drove away, and Ethan felt Mara shaking beside him, not with fear, but with fury. He knows, she said. He knows about Hutchins, about the accelerated timeline. This whole thing is coordinated. Probably has been from the start. Ethan watched the sedan disappear down the mountain. Someone wants this land badly enough to corrupt the system to get it. So we make sure they don't get it. Mara's voice turned to steel. We finish this barn and we pass that inspection, and we shove their corruption right back in their faces. They returned to work with renewed ferocity, and the afternoon blurred into evening, evening into night. Somewhere around 10 p.m., Ethan's phone rang. Sophie, calling from Marie's house. Dad, when are you coming home? The question hit him like a physical blow. He'd been so consumed with the barn that he'd barely seen his daughter in 4 days. Soon, sweetheart. We're almost done with a critical section. You always say soon. Her voice was small, and Ethan heard the loneliness underneath. I miss you. I miss you too. I promise, after this weekend, things go back to normal. You promise? I promise. He ended the call feeling torn in half. Part of him needed to be here, finishing this fight. But part of him needed to be with Sophie, being the father she deserved instead of the absent one he was becoming. Mara had stopped working, watching him with understanding. Go home. We have 2 days, and you have a daughter who needs you. We can spare you for 1 night. She gestured at the barn. I can handle detail work. Go be with Sophie. Ethan wanted to argue, but the loneliness in Sophie's voice echoed in his memory. You're sure? I'm sure. Give that remarkable kid a hug from me. He drove home through the dark, arrived to find Sophie still awake despite the late hour. She ran to him, and he caught her up in a hug that felt like coming back to himself. I'm sorry I've been gone so much, he said into her hair. Is the barn almost done? Almost. 2 more days of hard work, then the inspection. Sophie pulled back, studying his face with those 2 perceptive eyes. This is really important to you, isn't it? Yeah, it really is. Because of Mara or because of the barn? Ethan sat down, pulling Sophie onto his lap like he had when she was smaller. Both. The barn is a good project, the kind of work I became a builder to do, but Mara, she's fighting for something that matters to her, and she's doing it the right way, with integrity and determination. That's worth supporting. Do you like her? More than friend-like? The question was direct enough to make Ethan pause. Did he? Somewhere between the first day's refusal and tonight's fierce partnership, had something changed. I don't know, he said honestly. I respect her. I enjoy working with her. Whether that's more than friendship, I haven't had time to figure that out. Sophie nodded seriously. But you could see it maybe being more. Maybe, someday, when we're not racing impossible deadlines and fighting corrupt inspectors. Then you should tell her, after the inspection. You should tell her you want to figure out what this is. Ethan stared at his 7-year-old daughter, wondering how she'd become so wise. When did you learn about relationships? I read a lot. Plus, I pay attention. Sophie yawned, finally showing her exhaustion. You deserve to be happy, Dad. And she makes you happy. I can tell. He carried her to bed, tucked her in, and sat beside her until she slept. Then he sat in his workshop with his drafting table and tools, and tried to examine the truth Sophie had voiced so clearly. He did feel happy. Not the careful, controlled contentment he'd constructed over 3 years, but something messier and more real. The happiness of being challenged, of working beside someone who matched his intensity, of fighting for something that mattered. Whether that happiness had anything to do with Mara specifically, or just the work itself, he couldn't untangle. But Sophie was right about one thing. After this was over, he needed to figure it out. Day 27 arrived with threatening clouds and a weather forecast that made Ethan's stomach clench. Thunderstorms expected by afternoon, severe weather warnings for the mountain regions. They had maybe 6 hours of workable weather to finish all exterior elements. He arrived at the barn before sunrise to find Mara already working, installing the final pieces of trim with hands that moved like machines despite obvious exhaustion. Did you sleep at all? He asked. 2 hours. Couldn't shut my brain off. She passed him a nail gun. Help me finish this corner, then we can start on the doors. They worked in frantic silence as the clouds built overhead, dark and heavy with threat. The main doors needed to be hung and sealed, the windows installed and flashed, every gap caulked against water intrusion. By noon, they had most of it done, working with the desperate efficiency of people racing the sky. The first drops fell at 2 p.m. Big, heavy drops that promised worse to come. Ethan was on the roof securing the final section of ridge cap when the wind hit, sudden and violent, nearly ripping the shingles from his hands. "Ethan, get down!" Mara shouted from below. He scrambled for the ladder, but the wind had other plans. A gust caught the loose tarp covering their materials, sent it flying like a sail. The tarp's corner caught the ladder, sent it toppling sideways in what felt like slow motion. Ethan lunged for the roof edge, managed to grab it, but his boots lost purchase on the wet shingles. For one terrifying second, he hung suspended, his fingers the only thing between him and a 20-foot drop onto concrete piers. Then Mara was there, grabbing his wrists with strength he didn't know she had. "I've got you," she gritted out. "Pull." He pulled, she pulled, and somehow, impossibly, he got his knee over the edge, then his weight. Then he was sprawling on the roof, gasping while rain poured down around them. "You're okay," Mara said, her hand still gripping his arms. "You're okay." They lay there in the downpour, and Ethan felt his heart hammering against his ribs. A foot either direction, and he could have fallen. Could have left Sophie without a father. Could have ended everything over a piece of metal and bad timing. "We need to get inside," he finally managed. They half slid, half climbed down the roof to a section where the ladder could be repositioned, then scrambled into the barn's shelter. Inside they stood dripping and shaking, and the weight of what almost happened settled between them. "Thank you," Ethan said. "You saved my life." "You would have done the same." But Mara's voice shook. "Don't do that again. Don't scare me like that." He looked at her, really looked, and saw fear giving way to something else. Something that had been building between them for weeks, hidden under work and deadline and the safety of shared purpose. "Mara." The storm intensified, thunder cracking so close it rattled the barn's new windows. Rain came in sheets, testing every seal they'd made, every joint they'd caulked. They stood in the shelter they'd built together and watched nature try to tear it apart. But the barn held. Every beam stayed true. Every connection stayed solid. The roof didn't leak. The windows didn't fail. The structure stood firm against the assault, proof that their work had been good enough. When the worst of it passed, they did a damage assessment. A few shingles had lifted, needed to be resecured. Some caulk had washed away, needed to be replaced. But structurally, everything had survived. "We did it," Mara said quietly. "We actually built something that holds." Ethan thought about all the ways that statement was true. The barn, yes, but also something else. A partnership that had been tested and hadn't broken. A connection built on shared struggle and mutual respect, and the kind of trust that came from working side by side against impossible odds. Tomorrow was day 28. Tomorrow Hutchins would come with his clipboard and his agenda, looking for any excuse to fail them. Tomorrow the bank would be ready to foreclose, to take this land and sell it to developers who'd tear down what they'd built. But tonight, standing in the barn with rain drumming overhead and Mara's presence beside him, Ethan felt something he'd almost forgotten was possible. He felt ready to fight. They worked through the night repairing storm damage, their headlamps cutting narrow paths through darkness that felt heavier than usual. Every loose shingle had to be found and resecured, every questionable seal tested and reinforced. By dawn they were hollow-eyed and running on fumes, but the barn stood ready for judgment. Ethan checked his watch as pale light crept across the mountain. 6 hours until the inspection. 6 hours until Hutchins arrived with his clipboard and corruption, looking for any crack in their armor. "I need to get Sophie to school," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion. "I'll be back by 9. Go. I'll do a final walkthrough, make sure we didn't miss anything in the dark." Mara looked as tired as he felt, but her eyes were clear and focused. "We're ready, Ethan. Whatever he throws at us, we're ready." He wanted to believe her, wanted to trust that good work would triumph over bad faith. But he'd seen too many times how the system could be manipulated, how power could twist rules until right and wrong became irrelevant. The drive down the mountain gave him too much time to think about what would happen if they failed, if Hutchins found some technicality or invented some violation they couldn't defend against. Mara would lose the land, lose her father's legacy, lose the battle she'd fought with such fierce determination, and he would have failed her, failed to build something strong enough to withstand the assault. Sophie was waiting on the porch when he pulled up, already dressed and ready, her backpack organized with the precision she'd learned from watching him. "Big day," she said, climbing into the truck. "The biggest." "Are you scared?" Ethan considered lying, offering her the confidence she deserved from her father. But Sophie had always been able to read through his defenses, and honesty felt more respectful. "Yeah, I'm scared we did everything right and it still won't matter." Sophie reached across the console and squeezed his hand. "But you did everything right. That has to count for something. In a fair world, it would. Then make it count anyway. You always tell me that the hard thing and the right thing are usually the same thing. This is both." He looked at his daughter, 7 years old and already understanding truths that took most people decades to learn. "When did you get so smart?" "I have a good teacher." She smiled, and some of his tension eased. "You got this, Dad. I know you do." He dropped her at school with a hug that lasted longer than usual, then drove back up the mountain with his jaw set and his mind clear. Sophie was right. They'd done the work correctly. They'd built something worth defending. Now they just had to make the system acknowledge it. Mara met him at the barn with fresh coffee and a folder thick with documentation. Every permit, every material receipt, every photo showing code compliance. She'd organized it all with the same meticulous attention she brought to everything else. "I called an attorney," she said. "Friend from Denver who specializes in property law. She's on standby in case Hutchins tries anything blatantly illegal." "You think he will?" "I think he's being paid to find problems, and people don't like admitting they wasted someone's money." Mara handed him the coffee. "But we make him work for it. We challenge every citation, demand written justification for every complaint. We don't make it easy." They spent the next 2 hours doing a final inspection of their own, walking through every room with the codebook open, verifying that every element met or exceeded requirements. The foundation was solid, reinforced beyond minimum standards. The framing was square and true, every joint properly connected. The roof was sealed and vented. The electrical was tested and certified. The plumbing was roughed in correctly. It was good work. Better than good. It was the kind of work that would last decades, that would protect and serve and stand against whatever time and weather threw at it. At 11 o'clock exactly, Hutchins arrived. He emerged from his county vehicle wearing an expression that suggested he'd already made up his mind, clipboard in hand like a weapon. A younger man followed him, an assistant or witness, Ethan couldn't tell which. "Mr. Hutchins," Mara said, her voice professionally neutral. "Thank you for coming." "Mrs. Bennett, Mr. Cole." Hutchins barely glanced at them. "Let's get started. I have other inspections this afternoon." He moved through the barn with the focused intensity of someone hunting for prey. Every connection was scrutinized, every measurement questioned. He pulled out a laser level to check the foundation, spent 15 minutes examining the electrical panel, climbed into the loft space to inspect framing joints. Ethan and Mara followed in silence, taking notes when Hutchins pointed out concerns, photographing each area he examined. The assistant recorded everything on a tablet, his stylus moving constantly. "This joist hanger," Hutchins said, pointing to a connection in the roof framing. "It's not properly nailed. I count 3 nails instead of the required 4. Ethan moved closer, examined the hanger carefully. "That's a hurricane clip, not a standard joist hanger. Code requires 3 nails for that model. Here's the manufacturer spec." He pulled out the documentation, showed Hutchins the technical drawing. Hutchins frowned, made a note, moved on. "The stairway to the loft lacks proper railing." "The loft isn't finished living space," Mara countered. "Per code section 312. 4. Storage spaces accessed by ladder or ship stair don't require guardrails until they're converted to occupied space. We have plans to add railing when we complete that phase, but it's not required for this inspection." Another note. Another dissatisfied expression. Hutchins was finding that every criticism had an answer, every question had been anticipated. They moved outside, and Hutchins examined the foundation piers with particular attention. He measured distances, checked for cracks, tested the concrete surface. Ethan could see him searching, desperate for something that would justify his predetermined conclusion. "The pier spacing is irregular," Hutchins finally said. "This one is 6 inches closer to the building than the others, because it's reinforcing an original foundation stone that showed stress fractures." Ethan pulled out the structural engineer's report they'd commissioned. The engineer specified pier placement to distribute load around the existing foundation. "Everything's calculated and approved." Hutchins took the report, scanned it, his jaw tightening. The assistant kept recording, and Ethan wondered if the young man was seeing the same thing they were, an inspector trying to manufacture violations where none existed. The inspection stretched into the afternoon. Every system was tested, every detail examined. Hutchins found minor issues, a missing nail here, a caulk gap there, but nothing that rose to the level of code violation. Nothing that would justify failing the inspection. Around 3 o'clock, Hutchins called for a break. He and his assistant retreated to their vehicle, and Ethan watched them through the windshield having what looked like a heated discussion. The assistant was shaking his head, pointing at his tablet. "He's not finding what he needs," Mara said quietly. "We did it, Ethan. We actually did it. Don't celebrate yet? He's making a phone call." They watched Hutchins pull out his cell, watched his expression go from frustrated to angry to resigned. The call lasted 5 minutes, and when he emerged from the vehicle, something had changed in his demeanor. "I need to examine the electrical panel one more time," he announced. "There's a concern about the grounding system." They returned inside, and Hutchins spent 20 minutes at the panel, testing connections, checking voltage, studying wiring. Ethan stood close enough to observe, and he could see there was nothing wrong. The electrician had done flawless work, every connection perfect, every wire properly sized and routed. Finally, Hutchins stepped back. He looked at Mara and Ethan with something between respect and resentment. "The structure meets current building codes," he said, the words clearly costing him. "I'm approving occupancy for use as workshop and storage space. You'll need a separate permit and inspection if you convert the loft to living quarters." Mara's hand found Ethan's, squeezed hard. "Thank you," she managed. "Don't thank me. Thank your contractor. This is excellent work." Hutchins signed the inspection form, handed Mara a copy. "You should know that my office received several complaints about this project, anonymous complaints citing safety concerns and code violations. Based on my inspection, those complaints were unfounded." "Who filed them?" Ethan asked, though he already knew. Anonymous means anonymous, Mr. Cole, but I'll be noting in my report that the concerns were investigated and found to be without merit. Hutchins glanced at his assistant, who nodded slightly. Sometimes people use the system to advance private agendas. When I find evidence of that, I document it. He walked to his vehicle, and the assistant lingered for a moment. Nice work, the young man said quietly. I've been doing inspections for 2 years, and I've never seen better craftsmanship. Whatever pressure he was under, he couldn't deny quality like this. Then he was gone, leaving Ethan and Mara standing in the barn they'd saved, holding a piece of paper that changed everything. Mara's phone rang almost immediately. The bank officer, his voice cold and clipped. Ms. Bennett, I understand you received occupancy approval. That's correct. The improvements are complete and code compliant. Per the deed clause, I'm formally requesting refinancing negotiation. There was a long pause. My legal team will need to review the inspection report. Of course. I'll have my attorney forward all documentation. Mara's voice was steady, but Ethan could see her hands shaking. I'm sure we can reach an agreement that satisfies all parties. The call ended, and for a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Mara turned to Ethan, and the emotions she'd been holding back finally broke through. We did it, she whispered. We actually did it. He caught her as she swayed, exhaustion and relief hitting simultaneously. They stood in the center of the barn, surrounded by work they'd built together, and Ethan felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of what was possible. They'd fought the system and won. Not through connections or money or compromise, but through sheer quality of work and refusal to accept defeat. Your father would be proud, Ethan said. Mara pulled back, her eyes bright with tears. So would yours. They spent the next hour documenting everything. Photos of the signed inspection form, copies of all paperwork, timestamps proving completion before the foreclosure deadline. Mara's attorney called with congratulations and a strategy for the bank negotiation. The pressure was off, the worst was behind them. Around 5, Ethan realized he needed to pick up Sophie. Needed to bring his daughter home and sleep for about 12 hours straight. I should go, he said reluctantly. I know. Mara walked him to his truck, and the evening light caught her face in a way that made Ethan's breath catch. Thank you doesn't cover it. What you did, what you gave to this project, we did it together. I couldn't have finished without you. Maybe, but you could have walked away a dozen times. You didn't. She reached up, touched his face gently. You stayed, and you fought, and you built something that will outlast both of us. That means everything. Ethan covered her hand with his, feeling the calluses they'd earned together. So what happens now? Now I negotiate with the bank, get the refinancing terms locked down, start phase 2 of the restoration, the loft, the workshop space, all the finishing work we didn't have time for. She smiled. And I was hoping you might be interested in that work, if you're not too tired of this place. I don't think I could get tired of it. The truth of that settled around him. But I need to check with my business partner first. She has strong opinions about my schedule. Mara laughed. Smart woman. Tell Sophie I said hello. He drove down the mountain with the windows open despite the cold, letting the wind strip away exhaustion and fear and all the weight he'd carried for 28 days. The barn was saved. Mara's legacy was protected. They'd built something that would stand. Sophie was waiting on his sister's porch, and she took one look at his face and knew. You won, she said. We won. She ran to him, and he caught her up, spinning her around the way he had when she was smaller. Marie stood in the doorway smiling, and for the first time in 3 years, Ethan felt like his life was expanding instead of contracting. That night, after Sophie was asleep and the house was quiet, Ethan sat in his workshop with the inspection approval form and Mara's father's journal. He read through the entries again, seeing the progression of a man who'd loved a building enough to document its every flaw and virtue. On the last page, dated 3 months before the old man's death, was a single sentence. A building is never finished, only maintained. The real work is caring enough to keep going. Ethan understood that now. The barn would need ongoing attention, ongoing care. So would whatever was growing between him and Mara. So would his relationship with Sophie, his work, his life. Nothing was ever truly finished. The work was in showing up day after day and choosing to keep building. His phone buzzed, a text from Mara. "Thank you for everything, for believing this was possible when I wasn't sure I did." He typed back. "Same to you. Get some sleep. Tomorrow we start the next phase. Tomorrow." I like the sound of that. Ethan set down his phone and looked around his workshop. The tools he'd collected over years of work, the furniture he'd built for his daughter, the careful order he'd imposed on chaos. It was good work, solid work. But it was also lonely work. Maybe it was time to build something new. Not just structures of wood and steel, but connections that mattered, partnerships that lasted. The kind of foundation that could support whatever came next. The next morning arrived with clear skies and the particular light that comes after storms have passed. Ethan woke feeling more rested than he had in weeks, and he found Sophie already dressed and making pancakes with the focused determination she brought to everything. "Celebration breakfast," she announced. "You saved the barn, which means Mara gets to keep her dad's stuff, which means you're a hero." "I'm not a hero. I'm just a contractor who did his job." "You're a hero who did his job," Sophie corrected, flipping a pancake with surprising skill. "And heroes deserve pancakes." They ate together in comfortable silence, and Ethan felt the satisfaction of being exactly where he needed to be, home with his daughter, well-rested and well-fed, with work ahead that mattered. Around 9, his phone rang. An unknown number, and Ethan answered cautiously. "Mr. Cole, this is James Blackwood. We spoke at the construction site." Ethan's jaw tightened. "I remember. I wanted to congratulate you on completing the barn restoration. Impressive work, especially given the timeline." Blackwood's voice was smooth, professional. "My clients are disappointed, of course, but they respect quality craftsmanship. Is there a point to this call?" "Just extending professional courtesy, and perhaps planting a seed for future consideration." Blackwood paused. "Property development is ongoing in this region. We're always looking for contractors who deliver quality work on schedule. Someone with your skills could name their price." "I'm not interested in working for people who corrupt inspection processes." "I have no idea what you're referring to, but the offer stands should circumstances change." Blackwood ended the call, leaving Ethan staring at his phone with distaste. He called Mara immediately, told her about the conversation. "Trying to recruit you?" She sounded more amused than concerned. "I suppose that makes sense. If they can't beat us, they try to buy us." "I'm not for sale." "I know, that's one of the things I—" She stopped, and Ethan heard the shift in her tone. "One of the things I value about working with you." The almost confession hung between them, and Ethan felt his pulse quicken. But before he could respond, Mara continued in a more businesslike voice. "The bank wants to meet tomorrow. Their lawyers have reviewed the inspection approval, and they're ready to discuss terms. My attorney thinks we're in a strong position. That's good news. It's excellent news. And after it's settled, I was hoping we could talk. About phase 2 of the barn, but also about—" Another pause. "About other things." "Other things sounds good," Ethan said, his mouth suddenly dry. "Tomorrow then. After the bank meeting. I'll call you." He spent the rest of the day catching up on neglected tasks. Invoices that needed sending, equipment that needed maintenance, the ordinary business of being a contractor. But his mind kept drifting to tomorrow, to whatever conversation was waiting on the other side of Mara's bank meeting. Sophie noticed his distraction at dinner. "You're thinking about her again," she observed. "I'm thinking about a lot of things. But mostly her." Sophie grinned. "It's okay, Dad. I told you it was okay." "We're just working partners, Sophie." "For now. But you like her, and she likes you. I could tell at dinner." Ethan studied his daughter, this small person who seemed to understand emotional complexity he was still struggling to map. "If something did develop," he said carefully, "how would you feel about that?" Sophie considered the question seriously. "I'd feel happy that you weren't lonely anymore. And I'd feel good that you picked someone who works as hard as you do and cares about doing things right." She reached across the table, patted his hand. "I'd feel like maybe our family could get bigger instead of smaller." The simplicity of her answer made Ethan's throat tight. "You're pretty amazing, you know that." "I learned from the best," she smiled. "Now finish your vegetables. You're always telling me to eat healthy." That night, Ethan lay in bed trying to imagine what tomorrow might bring. Mara's bank meeting could go well or poorly. Their conversation afterward could clarify everything or complicate it further. The future was uncertain, full of variables he couldn't control, but he'd learned something over the past 28 days. Sometimes the best work happened when you stopped trying to control every outcome and just focused on building something solid. One decision at a time, one beam at a time, trusting the foundation to hold. The next day crawled by with agonizing slowness. Ethan tried to focus on paperwork, on planning future projects, but his mind kept circling back to his phone, waiting for Mara's call. It came at 3:30. "How did it go?" he asked immediately. "Better than expected. They're offering refinancing terms I can actually afford. The attorney thinks they're motivated to avoid any appearance of impropriety, especially after Hutchins' report mentioned unfounded complaints." Mara's voice carried relief and exhaustion in equal measure. "I'm keeping the land, Ethan. It's really happening." "That's incredible. Congratulations." "Thank you for everything." She paused. "Are you free this evening? I thought maybe we could talk, in person." "I'll get Sophie settled at Marie's. Where do you want to meet?" "The barn? It feels right somehow, to talk there." Ethan agreed, made arrangements with his sister, and drove up the mountain as the sun was beginning its descent. The barn looked different in the golden light, no longer a desperate construction site, but a completed structure, solid and true. Mara was waiting inside, leaning against her father's workbench. She'd cleaned up from the bank meeting, wearing jeans and a soft sweater instead of work clothes, and Ethan felt his heart do something complicated in his chest. "Hi," she said. "Hi." They stood in awkward silence for a moment, and Ethan realized this was harder than building a barn in 30 days. At least with construction, he knew the rules. With this, he was operating without blueprints. "I've been thinking," Mara finally said, "about what happens next. Phase 2 of the restoration, yes, but also about us, about what we've built together. I've been thinking about that too." "And what have you concluded?" Ethan moved closer, close enough to see the flecks of gold in her eyes, close enough to smell sawdust and something floral. Her shampoo, maybe. "I've concluded that I'm terrible at this, at understanding what's happening between people, at knowing when partnership becomes something else." He took a breath. "But I know that working with you felt different than any project I've done before. Not just because the work mattered, but because you mattered. The way you fought for this place, the way you learned and adapted and never quit. It reminded me that there are still things worth fighting for." Mara's eyes were bright, and she stepped closer. "I scared you, didn't I, when you almost fell from the roof?" "Terrified me, but not because of the fall." Ethan reached up, tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "Because I realized I had something to lose. Not just my life for Sophie's sake, but the possibility of this. Whatever this is. I think this might be two people who've been alone too long, realizing they don't have to be." "Yeah," Ethan agreed. "I think it might be that." She kissed him then, and it was nothing like he'd imagined. It was better, tentative and certain at once, tasting of coffee and possibility. They stood in the barn they'd built together, and Ethan felt something settle into place that he hadn't known was missing. When they finally pulled apart, Mara was smiling. "So," she said, "Phase 2. Are you interested in the work?" "Very interested, but I have conditions." "Name them." "Sundays still belong to Sophie, no exceptions, and we take this slow, both the construction and whatever's happening between us. I've got a daughter to think about, and she deserves to know that anyone I bring into our lives is staying." "I can work with that." Mara's hand found his. "I'm not going anywhere, Ethan. This barn, this land, it's home now, and I'd like you to be part of building it into something even better." They talked until the light faded, making plans for the loft conversion, for the workshop space, for all the finishing work that would transform the barn from saved structure to living legacy. And somewhere in the planning, they talked about other things, about Sophie and family dinners, about Mara meeting Ethan's sister, about the slow, careful work of building trust. When Ethan finally drove home, the mountain dark around him, he felt lighter than he had in years. The barn was saved. Mara had her father's legacy, and he had something he'd stopped believing in, a future that included more than just survival. Sophie was still awake when he arrived, sitting at the kitchen table with Marie and wearing an expression of barely contained curiosity. Well? She demanded. Well, what? Did you tell her? Did she tell you? Are you together now? Ethan looked at his sister, who shrugged with amusement. She's been like this for an hour, Marie said. I couldn't distract her. He sat down across from Sophie, suddenly serious. Yes, we talked, and yes, there's something there. But it's new and complicated, and we're taking it slow because I need to make sure that it's good for me, too. I know, Dad. Sophie reached across the table. And I'm telling you, it is. You're happy, really happy. I can see it. You're okay with this? Really? I'm okay with you not being alone anymore. I'm okay with you having someone who makes you smile like that. She grinned. Plus, Mara's cool. She knows about books and she asks me real questions instead of talking to me like I'm a baby. Ethan pulled his daughter into a hug, overwhelmed by her capacity for understanding and acceptance. When did you get so wise? He asked into her hair. I keep telling you, I had a good teacher. That night, lying in bed with exhaustion finally catching up, Ethan thought about foundations and structures and the things built to last. He'd spent 3 years constructing careful walls around his life, protecting Sophie and himself from the chaos of broken promises and failed relationships. But Mara had shown him something different. That sometimes the strongest structures weren't walls, but bridges. That sometimes protection meant taking risks instead of avoiding them. The barn had taught him that. Every day of those 28 days had been a lesson in trusting the foundation, in building with integrity, in refusing to compromise quality for convenience. And now he had a chance to apply those lessons to something even more important than a building, to build a life that was open instead of closed, that welcomed possibility instead of fearing it. It wouldn't be easy. Nothing worthwhile ever was. But he'd learned he could do hard things. He'd learned that partnership made impossible deadlines achievable. The two people working together could accomplish what seemed insurmountable alone. The barn stood on the mountain, its beams holding strong, its roof sealed against weather. Built right, or not at all. Ethan smiled into the darkness. He was ready to start building again. Spring arrived on this mountain with the kind of gentle insistence that made promises feel possible. 3 months had passed since the inspection, and the barn had transformed from saved structure to living workspace. Ethan found himself making the drive up the winding road 4 days a week now, the journey so familiar that his truck seemed to navigate the turns on muscle memory alone. This morning he had Sophie with him, her small presence in the passenger seat filling the cab with chatter about her upcoming science fair project. It was Saturday, technically his day off, but Mara had invited them both up for what she called a celebration lunch. The loft conversion was complete, the workshop space was operational, and she wanted to share it with the people who'd helped make it possible. Is Marie coming too? Sophie asked, adjusting her seatbelt. She said she'd try. Depends on whether the bakery gets slammed. Ethan navigated a tight curve, the valley dropping away to their right. But it'll be us for sure. Good. I want to show Mara my drawings for the bookshelf project. Sophie had her sketchbook open on her lap, filled with careful measurements and design notes. Think she'll help me build it? I think she'd be honored, you asked. They crested the final hill, and the barn came into view. New paint gleamed on the siding, a warm red that Mara had chosen to honor the original color her grandfather had used. The windows caught morning sunlight, and smoke rose from the chimney of the small wood stove they'd installed for heat. It looked alive now, purposeful, exactly what a barn should be. Mara emerged as they parked, wearing jeans and a work shirt with the sleeves rolled up. Her hair was longer now, pulled back in the practical ponytail Ethan had come to associate with her, and she was smiling in the way that still made his heart do complicated things. Perfect timing, she called. I just finished setting up the surprise. Surprise? Sophie was out of the truck immediately, curiosity overriding caution as usual. Inside. But close your eyes first. Sophie complied with exaggerated seriousness, and Mara guided her through the barn's main door. Ethan followed, and what he saw made him stop in his tracks. The workshop space had been transformed. Mara's father's workbench stood in place of honor, but now it was surrounded by new equipment, a table saw, a drill press, a full set of hand tools organized on pegboard walls. But the real surprise was the smaller workbench positioned beside the larger one, perfectly scaled for someone Sophie's size. Okay, open. Mara said. Sophie's eyes went wide. Is that for me? If you want it. I thought maybe you'd like to have your own space here, for when you're visiting, or when you want to work on projects. Mara glanced at Ethan, suddenly uncertain. I should have asked first. I just thought, it's perfect, Ethan said, his throat unexpectedly tight. Really perfect. Sophie was already at the small bench, running her hands over the smooth surface, testing the height of the stool, examining the small tool set arranged with the same care Mara brought to everything. This is the best thing ever, she breathed. Can I really use it whenever I want? Whenever you're here, it's yours. Mara crouched beside her. Your dad told me you wanted to learn furniture making. I thought maybe we could work together sometimes. You could help me with projects, learn the techniques your way. Sophie threw her arms around Mara's neck, and Ethan watched something transform in Mara's expression, surprise giving way to warmth, the kind that came from being accepted by someone whose opinion mattered. Thank you, Sophie said. This is even better than Christmas. They spent the morning in the workshop, Mara teaching Sophie basic joinery, while Ethan worked on installing the final pieces of trim in the loft space. The sounds drifted up to him. Sophie's questions, Mara's patient explanations, the occasional laugh when something went wrong in an instructive way. It felt domestic and comfortable, like pieces clicking into place. Around noon, Marie arrived with a basket from the bakery and news that made her eyes dance with barely contained excitement. I wasn't going to say anything yet, she announced, but I can't keep secrets from you people. David proposed last night. The workshop erupted in congratulations, Sophie bouncing with excitement while Ethan pulled his sister into a hug. About time he made it official, Ethan said. When's the wedding? Fall, probably. Small ceremony, family and close friends. Marie looked at Mara. Which includes you, obviously. You're family now. Mara's eyes went bright, and Ethan saw her blink back emotion. In the 3 months since the barn was saved, she and Marie had developed their own friendship, bonding over shared exasperation with Ethan's tendency to work too many hours and Sophie's precocious intelligence. They ate lunch on the new deck Ethan had built off the barn's south side. Sandwiches and pastries, and the easy conversation of people who'd learned to be comfortable together. Sophie regaled Marie with details about the workbench, and Marie shared wedding planning anxieties, and Mara asked Ethan's opinion on whether to convert the old hayloft into additional storage or leave it as open cathedral space. Leave it open, Ethan said. The volume makes the whole building feel bigger, plus the light through those windows is worth preserving. Always the architect, Mara teased. Always the builder, he corrected. Architects design dreams, builders make them stand up. After lunch, Marie took Sophie down to the creek to look for interesting stones, giving Ethan and Mara a rare moment of privacy. They stood on the deck watching Sophie pick her way along the water's edge, her aunt close behind. She's happy, Mara observed. Really happy. She is, because of this. Ethan gestured at the barn, the mountain, the life that had opened up around them. Because of you. I just gave her a workbench. You gave her more than that. You gave her a space that's hers, a place to learn and create. You gave her attention and patience and respect. He turned to face Mara directly. You gave her what I've been trying to give her for 3 years, proof that people can be trusted to stay. Mara took his hand, lacing their fingers together. I meant what I said before. I'm not going anywhere. I know, but knowing and believing are different things. Ethan looked out at the valley. Emma left so suddenly. One day we were a family, the next day she was gone. It taught Sophie that people disappear. And it taught me to build walls instead of bridges. And now? Now I'm learning that some bridges are worth building, even when they're scary. Especially then. He squeezed her hand. You've been patient with us. With me being slow and careful and probably ridiculous. You're protecting your daughter. That's not ridiculous. That's beautiful. Mara leaned against his shoulder. And I can be patient. I waited 8 months to save this barn. I can wait however long it takes for you to trust that this is real. They stood in comfortable silence until Sophie's voice drifted up from the creek. She'd found a stone with fossil imprints and was explaining its geological significance to Marie with the confidence of someone who'd read too many science books. She's going to be a professor someday, Mara said, or an engineer, or a builder. or all three simultaneously. Ethan smiled. Whatever she wants, she'll make it happen. She's got that kind of determination. Wonder where she learned that. The afternoon slipped into evening, and when Marie finally announced she needed to get back to town, Sophie was reluctant to leave her new workbench. Can we come back tomorrow? She asked Ethan. Tomorrow's Sunday. That's our day together. But what if we spent our Sunday here? We could work on my bookshelf project, all three of us. Sophie looked between Ethan and Mara with hopeful eyes. Please? Ethan felt the familiar protective instinct rise. Sundays were sacred, the one day he reserved exclusively for Sophie. But looking at his daughter's eager face, at Mara's careful neutrality that told him she'd support whatever he decided, he realized the rule had become less about protection and more about control. If Mara doesn't mind us invading her space on a Sunday, he said carefully. I'd love that, Mara said immediately. We could make it a tradition, Sunday workshop days. Sophie cheered, and the matter was settled. As they drove down the mountain in the fading light, Ethan felt another wall coming down, another piece of his carefully controlled life opening to possibility. Dad? Sophie asked as they navigated the curves. Do you love her? The question caught him off guard. That's a pretty serious question. It's a serious topic. You're spending a lot of time together. She gave me a workbench. You smile different when you talk about her. Sophie's logic was relentless as always. So do you? Ethan thought about how to answer honestly without overwhelming his 7-year-old daughter with adult complexity. I care about her very much, and those feelings are growing into something that might be love, yes. But love is complicated, Sophie. It takes time to develop and understand. Okay, but you're not just being careful for me, right? Because I like her. I like how she treats you and how she treats me and how she makes you happy. Sophie turned in her seat to look at him directly. You don't have to protect me from good things, Dad. The wisdom in those words hit him like a physical force. She was right. Somewhere along the way, his caution had stopped being about protection and started being about fear. Fear of being hurt again. Fear of Sophie being disappointed. Fear of opening his life to variables he couldn't control. You're right, he said quietly. I've been holding back because I'm scared. But that's my issue to work through, not yours to manage. So you'll stop being weird about it? I'll try to stop being weird about it. Good. Because she's really nice and I want her to stick around. Sophie settled back in her seat, satisfied. Plus her workshop is amazing and I want to build at least 17 projects there. That night, after Sophie was asleep and the house was quiet, Ethan sat in his own workshop thinking about fear and courage and the difference between them. He'd built a good life here, safe and stable and predictable. But safe wasn't the same as fulfilled. Stable wasn't the same as happy. His phone buzzed, a text from Mara. Sophie's workbench was a hit. Thank you for letting me be part of her life. He stared at the message, at the careful way she phrased it, not assuming, not demanding, just grateful for what was offered. That was Mara. Patient and respectful and willing to earn trust instead of expecting it automatically. He typed back, Thank you for being someone worth trusting. It means more than you know. Her response came quickly. Sleep well, Ethan. See you tomorrow. Tomorrow, Sunday. Their day that was becoming a shared day, boundaries blurring in ways that should have scared him, but instead felt right. Ethan looked around his workshop at the furniture he'd built for Sophie, at the tools he'd used to construct a life of careful control. It was good work, but it was also incomplete. Maybe it was time to finish what he'd started on that first day at the barn. Time to build something that wasn't just about surviving, but about living. The next morning dawned clear and warm, the kind of perfect spring day that made promises feel achievable. Sophie was awake before him, already dressed and packing her sketchbook and pencils. We're building today, she announced. I need to be prepared. They drove up the mountain together, and Ethan felt the familiar landscape take on new significance. This wasn't just a job site anymore. It was becoming something else, a place that held possibility, that connected the careful life he'd built to the larger life he was learning to want. Mara had coffee ready when they arrived, and the three of them spent the morning in the workshop planning Sophie's bookshelf project. Mara taught Sophie to read plans, to measure twice and cut once, to understand that good work took patience and precision. Watching them work together, Ethan felt something settle in his chest. This was what family looked like. Not necessarily the traditional structure he'd grown up with, but something equally valid. People choosing to show up for each other, to teach and learn and build together. Around noon, they took a break, and Sophie wandered outside to explore while Ethan and Mara cleaned sawdust from the workbench. "She's a natural," Mara said. "The way she visualizes spatial relationships, how she thinks through problems, she's got real talent." She gets that from her mother, actually. Emma was an architect before she decided corporate law paid better. Ethan rarely talked about his ex-wife, but with Mara it felt safe. "Sophie has her creativity and my stubbornness. Dangerous combination." "The best combinations usually are." Mara set down her rag, turned to face him. "Can I ask you something? And you can tell me if it's too personal." "Ask." "Well, why did Emma leave? I know it's none of my business, but I keep wondering what kind of person walks away from Sophie." Ethan leaned against the workbench, considering how to explain something he still didn't fully understand himself. "She said she felt trapped, that marriage and motherhood weren't what she'd expected, that she'd lost herself in trying to be what everyone needed." He rubbed his jaw. "Looking back, I think she was right to leave. Not right to abandon Sophie, but right to leave me. I was so focused on building the perfect stable life that I forgot to ask if it was the life she actually wanted. That's not your fault. Isn't it? I built walls around us without realizing I was building a cage." He met Mara's eyes. "That's why I've been so careful with you. Why I keep hesitating even when everything in me wants to move forward. I'm terrified of doing the same thing again, of imposing my vision of what life should be without leaving room for what it could be." Mara moved closer, took both his hands in hers. "Ethan, I'm not Emma. I know what I want, and I'm not afraid to say when something isn't working. You don't have to protect me from yourself. But what if I mess this up? What if I'm too rigid or controlling, or then we'll talk about it. We'll adjust. We'll figure it out together." She squeezed his hands. "That's what partnership means. Not one person building everything while the other just inhabits it, but both of us building together, like the barn." The comparison was perfect, and Ethan felt the last of his resistance crumble. She was right. The barn had worked because they'd built it together, each contributing skills and perspective, neither one dominating or deferring. That was the model worth following. "I love you," he said, the words surprising him with their simplicity. "I've been trying to be careful and measured about it, but the truth is I fell in love with you somewhere between day 3 and day 28, probably around the time you pulled me off that roof. Or maybe before that. I don't know exactly when, but I know it's true." Mara's eyes were bright with emotion. "I love you too, have for weeks. Maybe since you first explained why we had to build it right or not at all." She laughed, a little shaky. "I kept thinking you were just being a perfectionist, but then I realized it was integrity. You actually believe that quality matters, that doing things right is worth the extra effort. That's who you are." He kissed her then, properly this time, without hesitation or reservation. It felt like completion, like the final beam slotting into place in a structure that had been waiting to be whole. When they finally pulled apart, Sophie was standing in the doorway with a satisfied expression. "About time," she announced. "I was starting to think I'd have to lock you in the loft together until you figured it out." "How long have you been standing there?" Ethan asked. "Long enough to know you finally said the L word, which is good because it was getting painful watching you two dance around it." Sophie walked over, inserted herself between them. "So are we officially a family now, or do we need to have a meeting about it?" Mara crouched down to Sophie's level. "What do you think? Do you want us to be a family?" "Obviously. I already told Dad you make him happy, and you gave me a workbench, and you're teaching me to build things. Plus, you don't talk to me like I'm stupid, which most adults do." Sophie's expression turned serious. "But I need to know you're not going to leave. My mom left, and it really sucked. So if you're going to leave eventually, I'd rather know now." "Sophie," Ethan started, but Mara held up a hand. "That's a fair question, and you deserve an honest answer." She took Sophie's hands. "I can't promise that nothing will ever go wrong, because life doesn't work that way. But I can promise that if there are problems, I'll talk about them instead of running. And I can promise that I love your dad, and I love getting to know you, and I'm choosing to be here. Every day I'm choosing this. Sophie studied her for a long moment, then nodded. Okay, that's a good answer. She looked at Ethan. Dad, you good with this? I'm very good with this. Then it's settled. We're a family. Sophie grinned. Now can we please finish planning my bookshelf? I have very specific design requirements. They spent the rest of the afternoon working together, and Ethan felt the rightness of it settle into his bones. This was what he'd been afraid to want. Not just a partner, but a family that chose to be together. Not bound by obligation or desperation, but by genuine care and shared purpose. As the sun lowered toward the western peaks, Marie arrived with an unexpected guest. David, her fiancé, had come to see the barn that had consumed so much of Ethan's time and attention. So this is the famous project, David said, looking around the workshop with appreciation. Marie told me about the deadline, the corrupt inspector, the whole saga. I'm impressed you pulled it off. We pulled it off, Ethan corrected, nodding toward Mara. Couldn't have done it alone. They gave David the full tour, the reinforced foundation, the rebuilt framing, the loft space that now served as both storage and gallery for Mara's father's finished pieces. David asked good questions, showing genuine interest, and Ethan felt grateful that his sister had found someone worth keeping. As they stood on the deck watching the sunset paint the valley in shades of gold and amber, Marie pulled Ethan aside. You look happy, she said quietly. Really, genuinely happy. I haven't seen you like this since before Emma left. I am happy. Terrified, but happy. Good. You deserve both. You deserve... Marie squeezed his arm. Mara's good for you. Good for Sophie, too. Don't screw it up by overthinking it. Since when are you the relationship expert? Since I spent 5 years dating David before accepting that good things don't have to be complicated to be real. She smiled. Sometimes the right choice is the obvious one. You just have to stop looking for reasons to disqualify it. Later, after Marie and David had left and Sophie had fallen asleep in the truck from exhaustion, Ethan stood with Mara on the deck, watching stars emerge against the darkening sky. I've been thinking, Mara said, about Phase 3 of the barn restoration. There's a Phase 3? There could be, converting the upper level into living space. Not for me. I like my house in Denver, but maybe for someone who drives up here 4 days a week and might want a place to stay. She glanced at him. Or for someone who might want to split time between two places eventually. Ethan absorbed the implication. She was offering him space, literally and figuratively. Room to integrate his life with hers without demanding he abandon what he'd built. That's a big project, he said carefully. I've learned that big projects are possible if you have the right partner. She turned to face him. I'm not asking you to move in tomorrow. I'm just saying there's space here for you, for Sophie, for whatever version of this we want to build together. What if Sophie wants to stay in town? Her school, her friends? Then we figure it out. Maybe we split time. Maybe we make this a weekend place. Maybe we wait until she's older and let her help decide. Mara's voice was patient. I'm not trying to force a timeline, Ethan. I'm just letting you know the foundation is here when you're ready to build on it. The metaphor was perfect, and Ethan felt himself smiling. You're speaking my language now. I learned from the best. They stood in the mountain darkness, and Ethan felt the future stretch out before him, not predetermined or controlled, but open, full of possibility and, yes, risk, but also joy and partnership, and the kind of love that came from choosing each other every day. In the truck, Sophie stirred but didn't wake. This small person who'd given him permission to be happy, who'd seen what he needed before he understood it himself. She deserved a life that was bigger than just safe. She deserved to see that taking chances on good things was worth the risk. I'd like to build Phase 3, Ethan said. Not right away, but soon, when Sophie's ready, when the timing feels right. No rush, the foundation isn't going anywhere. Mara leaned against him. Neither am I. They stayed until the cold drove them inside, and Ethan carried sleeping Sophie to the truck while Mara locked up the workshop. The drive down the mountain was quiet, but it was the comfortable quiet of people who didn't need to fill silence with words. At his house, Mara helped him get Sophie inside and tucked into bed. They stood in the doorway watching her sleep, and Ethan felt the completeness of the moment, past and future meeting in the present, all the pieces finally aligned. Stay, he said quietly. Not forever, not tonight, but for coffee in the morning. So Sophie wakes up and sees that you keep showing up. I'd like that. They sat on the porch in the cool night air, and Ethan told her about his plans for the next few months, projects he'd committed to, schedule adjustments he could make to spend more time at the barn. Mara shared her own plans, the furniture commissions she was starting to take, using her father's tools and workspace to honor his legacy while building her own. Somewhere around midnight, she fell asleep against his shoulder, and Ethan felt the trust in that gesture. She felt safe with him, safe enough to be vulnerable, to show exhaustion, to stop performing competence for a moment. He shifted carefully to make her more comfortable, and she murmured something unintelligible but didn't wake. The stars wheeled overhead, and Ethan thought about foundations and structures and the difference between building walls and building homes. For 3 years he'd focused on walls, protection, stability, control. But walls could become prisons if you weren't careful. They could keep out hurt, but they also kept out joy. Mara had shown him another way, not abandoning caution entirely, but balancing it with courage. Building spaces that were solid enough to feel safe, but open enough to let in light and air and possibility. That was the real work. Not just constructing shelter, but creating space where life could flourish. The next morning, Sophie found them on the porch, Ethan awake and keeping watch while Mara slept against his shoulder. His daughter stood in the doorway studying the scene, then smiled with satisfaction. "This is good," she announced. "You should do this more often." "Sit on the porch all night?" "Be together where I can see it, so I know it's real." Sophie came and sat on Ethan's other side. "I like knowing you're not alone anymore, Dad. It makes me less worried about you." "You worry about me?" "All the time. You work too hard and forget to eat lunch, and sometimes you look really sad when you think I'm not watching." She leaned against him. "But you don't look sad anymore. You look like you're building something good." Out of the mouths of 7-year-olds, Ethan thought, perfect clarity wrapped in simple observation. Mara stirred, woke, and looked momentarily disoriented before remembering where she was. "Did I fall asleep on you? I'm sorry." "Don't apologize," Ethan said. "It was nice. Felt right." They made breakfast together, the three of them moving through the kitchen with increasing coordination. Sophie set the table with geometric precision while Mara made coffee and Ethan handled the eggs and toast. It felt domestic and normal, and exactly like what family should be, people taking care of each other without fanfare or obligation. Over breakfast, they planned the week ahead. Ethan had 2 days of work on a deck installation, then 3 days free for the barn. Mara had client meetings in Denver on Wednesday and Thursday, but could work from the barn the rest of the week. Sophie had her science fair on Friday and wanted everyone there to see her project. "Everyone?" Mara asked carefully. "Dad, Aunt Marie, David, and you." Sophie looked at Mara directly. "You're part of everyone now." "I'd be honored," Mara said, and Ethan heard the emotion in her voice. The weeks that followed developed their own rhythm. Ethan worked his contracted jobs during the week, spent evenings and weekends at the barn with Mara and Sophie. They built furniture together, refined the workshop space, started planning the loft conversion. Sophie's bookshelf took shape slowly, each joint a lesson in patience and precision. Marie's wedding in October brought everyone together, a small ceremony in the same church where Ethan had married Emma a lifetime ago. But this time felt different. This time he stood as best man watching his sister marry someone who truly deserved her, with Mara beside him and Sophie serving as flower girl with solemn importance. At the reception, David pulled Ethan aside. "Marie tells me you're thinking about proposing," he said. Ethan nearly choked on his champagne. "She what?" "Don't worry, she didn't breach confidence. I'm just observant. And you've had that look for weeks, the same look I had before I proposed. Like you're carrying a secret that's both exciting and terrifying." "Is it that obvious?" "To people who know you, yes." David smiled. "For what it's worth, I think it's the right move. Mara's good for you, good for Sophie, and you're better together than either of you are alone." Ethan watched Mara dancing with Sophie across the room, both of them laughing at something only they understood. In 6 months, she'd become essential to their lives, not by demanding space, but by earning it. One conversation at a time, one Sunday workshop session at a time, one quiet moment of showing up when it mattered. That night, after the reception wound down and Sophie was asleep in the car, Ethan drove to the barn instead of home. Mara followed in her own vehicle, understanding without asking that he needed to be in this space for what came next. They stood in the workshop, surrounded by tools and sawdust and the evidence of work done well. "I've been thinking about foundations," Ethan said. "You're always thinking about foundations." "True, but I've been thinking about this foundation specifically, what we've built here." He turned to face her directly. "6 months ago, I came up this mountain expecting to say no, to protect myself and Sophie from getting invested in something that would probably fail. But you changed that. You showed me that some things are worth the risk." Mara's expression shifted, understanding dawning. "Ethan, let me finish, please." He took her hands. "I've spent 3 years building walls. Safe, solid walls that kept out hurt, but also kept out hope. You tore down those walls and showed me how to build something better, something open and strong and built to last." He pulled the ring from his pocket, simple, handmade by a jeweler Marie knew, the band inlaid with wood from her father's workshop. "So I'm asking if you want to make this foundation permanent, if you want to keep building this life together, officially and forever." Mara's eyes were wet with tears. "Are you sure? Really sure? Because I need you to be certain, not just caught up in the moment. I'm certain. I've never been more certain of anything except that Sophie is mine, and I would build her the world if I could." He smiled. "But I can't build the world alone, and I don't want to try. I want to build it with you." "Yes," Mara said, her voice breaking. "Yes, of course, yes." He slid the ring onto her finger, and she pulled him into a kiss that tasted like salt and joy and the future they were choosing together. When they finally separated, they were both crying and laughing at the same time. "Sophie is going to be so smug about this," Ethan said. "She's been predicting it for months." "She's been predicting it since the day we met," Mara corrected. "Your daughter is terrifyingly perceptive." They sat on the deck watching stars emerge, and Ethan felt the rightness of it settle around him like a well-fitted joint. This was where he was meant to be. Not just physically in this place, but emotionally in this moment, choosing love over fear, partnership over isolation, the messy, complicated beauty of building a life with someone instead of just existing in careful solitude. "When do you want to tell Sophie?" Mara asked. "Tomorrow morning, together. She deserves to hear it from both of us." "And everyone else?" "We can figure that out as we go. No rush." Ethan laced his fingers through hers. "I spent so long rushing to build walls and security. I want to take our time with this, do it right." "Built right or not at all," Mara quoted, and Ethan laughed at hearing his own philosophy reflected back. They stayed until the cold drove them inside, then locked up the barn and drove separately down the mountain. At his house, Mara kissed him goodnight with a promise to return in the morning. "I love you," she said. "I love this life we're building." "I love you too. See you at breakfast." He watched her drive away, then went inside to find Sophie standing in the hallway, wearing her pajamas and a knowing expression. "You proposed, didn't you?" she said. Not a question, a statement. "How did you—" "You have the same look David had after he proposed to Aunt Marie. Plus you're home late, which means you were doing something important at the barn." She walked over, hugged him around the waist. "I'm happy for you, Dad. For both of you. We were going to tell you in the morning, together. I can pretend to be surprised if you want." Ethan laughed, overwhelmed by this small person who understood so much. "That might be nice, actually." "Okay, but just so you know, I'm really excited, and I already have ideas for what I should wear to the wedding." The next morning, they told her officially over breakfast, and Sophie managed an acceptable performance of surprise before abandoning pretense entirely and asking detailed questions about wedding plans. Mara handled it with grace, involving Sophie in decisions about venue and timing, making it clear that this wasn't just about the adults, but about the three of them becoming an official family. The engagement sparked a flurry of planning and celebration. Marie was predictably delighted, taking credit for introducing them, even though she'd had nothing to do with it. David offered to help with wedding carpentry needs. Friends from town who'd watched Ethan rebuild his life alone celebrated seeing him choose partnership. Through it all, work on the barn continued. The loft conversion progressed slowly but steadily, transformed from storage space into a bright open area that could serve as guest quarters or eventually living space. Sophie's bookshelf was completed and installed in her room at home, a tangible reminder of what they could build together. Winter arrived on the mountain with the first real snow, and Ethan found himself driving up the familiar road with chains on his tires and Sophie bundled in the passenger seat. They'd come to help Mara winterize the barn, to prepare it for the season ahead. Working in the cold, they installed storm windows and checked insulation, tested the wood stove and stacked firewood in the covered area Ethan had built for that purpose. The barn stood ready to face whatever weather came, solid and true, every joint holding exactly as it should. "It's beautiful," Sophie said, standing back to admire their work. "All the things you built together, it's really beautiful." She was right, not just the physical structure, but what it represented. A legacy saved, a partnership forged, a family built from choice and commitment, and the daily work of showing up. That evening, the three of them sat around the wood stove while snow fell outside. Sophie read from her current book. Mara sketched designs for the furniture commissions that now kept her workshop busy, and Ethan sat with plans spread before him, preliminary drawings for the house they'd build together eventually, combining his need for structure with her vision for open space. "What do you think?" he asked, showing Mara the latest iteration. She studied the plans carefully. "I think it's perfect. Solid foundation, good bones, room to grow, everything a home should be." "It's everything we are," Ethan corrected. "Built right, meant to last." Sophie looked up from her book. "You two are really sappy sometimes. You know that, right?" "We're not sappy, we're romantic," Mara protested. "Same thing, but I guess it's okay. Better than when Dad was all grumpy and alone." They laughed, and the sound filled the barn with warmth that had nothing to do with the wood stove. Outside, snow continued to fall, but inside they were safe and together, building the kind of life that would weather whatever storms came. Ethan looked at Mara across the plans, at Sophie content with her book, at the barn that had brought them all together. He thought about the man who'd driven up this mountain 6 months ago expecting to say no, expecting to maintain his careful walls and controlled life. That man was gone, replaced by someone who understood that the best foundations weren't built from fear, but from courage. That the strongest structures weren't the ones that shut out the world, but the ones that stood firm while welcoming it in. "Thank you," he said to Mara. "For what?" "For fighting for this barn, for making me part of that fight, for showing me what's possible when you refuse to give up on something worth saving." "We saved each other," Mara said simply. "The barn was just the excuse to start building something better." Sophie made a gagging noise. "Seriously, so sappy. I'm going to make hot chocolate. You two need a moment, apparently." She retreated to the small kitchen area, leaving them alone in the warm glow of the stove. Ethan pulled Mara close, and she settled against him with the easy comfort of someone who knew she belonged. Outside, the storm continued, but inside the barn they'd built together, with patience and precision and the kind of love that came from choosing each other every single day, they were home. And home, Ethan had learned, wasn't just a structure you built. It was a promise you kept, a foundation you maintained, a life you chose to build with someone who understood that quality mattered, that doing things right was worth the extra effort, that some things were built to last. The barn would stand for decades, maybe longer. A testament to what two people could accomplish when they refused to accept that impossible was the same as insurmountable. But more than that, it would stand as a reminder that sometimes the best things in life came from taking chances on what seemed too hard, too risky, too complicated. That sometimes saying yes to uncertainty was the bravest thing you could do. Ethan Cole had come to this mountain to say no, but instead he'd learned to say yes, to partnership, to love, to the messy, beautiful work of building a life that was worth the fight. And every beam that held, every joint that stayed true, every storm that passed leaving the structure intact, all of it was proof that he'd made the right choice. Built right, or not at all. He'd built it right, and it would last.